I asked my wife to clean a few rooms while my son was away on a luxury vacation. I thought it was just a simple favor for the boy we raised, but minutes later she called me shaking so hard she could barely breathe, whispering that there was a child crying in the locked attic. What we found behind that heavy steel deadbolt shattered my reality and made me realize the monster I was hunting was the very son I had spent my entire life trying to protect. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 68 years old. For over 40 years, I ran a commercial towing and diesel repair fleet. I spent my life underneath 18-wheelers, my hands stained with grease and oil, working 80-hour weeks to provide a solid foundation for my family. A few years ago, I quietly sold that fleet to a national logistics company for a massive sum. I never bragged about the money. I prefer my worn denim jackets and my quiet mornings on the porch. My son Connor chose a very different path. He wanted the flash, the country club memberships, the imported cars. He became a real estate mogul, building an empire on debt and appearances. He married Jessica, a high society woman who looked at my calloused hands like they were a disease. They live in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar suburban estate. It is a sterile, perfectly curated fortress of glass and white marble. 3 days ago, they flew to Tuscany for a 3-week luxury wine tour. They asked my wife Susan and me to house sit. Connor was very specific about the rules. He gave us a list of instructions, but one directive was repeated 3 times. We were strictly forbidden from entering the East Wing attic. Connor claimed he was doing mid-century historical renovations up there. He said the floorboards were rotten, the wiring was dangerously exposed, and there was a high risk of black mold. I am a man who respects boundaries, so I promised him we would not go near that wing. This morning I drove down to the local hardware store to pick up some mulch for my own garden. I was loading the heavy bags into the back of my pickup truck when my cell phone rang. I wiped the dirt from my hands and answered. It was Susan. But she was not just talking. She was weeping uncontrollably. Her breaths were coming in sharp, frantic gasps. She sounded like she was suffocating. I dropped the bag of mulch right there in the parking lot. I asked her what was wrong. My heart instantly hammering against my ribs. Susan managed to choke out the words. She said she was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she noticed a terrible foul odor coming from the central air vents. She thought a rodent had died in the ductwork. She opened Connor's heavy mahogany desk to look for a flashlight and found a heavy brass master key hidden in a false bottom drawer. She followed the smell. It led her straight to the heavy doors of the East Wing attic. Then her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. She said she heard something through the thick wood. It was not the sound of exposed wiring or settling floorboards. It was a whimper, a soft, agonizing whimper of a human being. She told me there was a child crying in the attic. I told her to step away from the door, to not touch anything, and to wait for me. I hung up the phone, jumped into my truck, and drove like a madman. I broke every speed limit between the hardware store and that sterile suburban estate. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the madness. Connor and Jessica did not have children. Jessica had always made it very clear that a child would ruin her perfect body and her curated lifestyle. Why would there be a child crying in a locked renovation zone? I threw my truck into park on their pristine paved driveway, grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from my toolbox, and sprinted to the front door. I unlocked it and took the stairs 2 at a time. My knees ached, but adrenaline drowned out the pain. I found Susan at the end of the long, carpeted hallway. She was pale as a ghost, her hands covering her mouth, staring at the massive oak door that sealed off the East Wing attic. I walked up to the door and pressed my ear against the cold wood. It was faint, but I heard it. A small, rhythmic sobbing. The sound of someone who had cried so much they had no energy left to scream. I looked at the door itself, and my decades of mechanical experience immediately registered a terrifying truth. Connor had told us the room was a dangerous construction zone to keep us out. But the deadbolt on this door was not designed to keep people out. It was a heavy-duty commercial-grade lock installed on the outside of the door. You only put a lock on the outside of a solid oak door when you are trying to keep something trapped inside. Susan handed me the brass master key with trembling fingers. She was shaking so violently I had to guide her hand. I slid the key into the heavy cylinder and turned it. The mechanism clicked with a heavy metallic thud. I pushed the handle and threw my shoulder against the wood. The door swung inward, and the stench hit me like a physical blow. It was not the smell of black mold or dead rodents. It was the smell of human waste, stale sweat, and profound neglect. I stepped into the room gripping the crowbar, tightly prepared for anything. But what I saw completely shattered my reality. There were no exposed wires. There were no mid-century renovations. The room had been completely stripped of any sharp edges or dangerous objects. The windows were boarded up and screwed shut from the inside with thick plywood. The sharp corners of the baseboards were padded. In the center of the room sat a plastic bucket functioning as a makeshift toilet. It was not a construction zone. It was a plush, customized prison cell built right inside a luxury suburban home. In the far corner of the room, huddled tightly against the padded wall, was a child. It was a little boy, maybe 6 years old. He was severely malnourished, his small collarbones poking through a filthy, oversized t-shirt. His dark hair was matted to his forehead with sweat. He was curled into a tight ball, his knees pulled up to his chest, shaking with a terror so deep it made my own soul ache. When he saw me step into the room, he did not cry out for help. He did not run to me. Instead, he scrambled backward, trying to press himself deeper into the wall, as if he expected me to strike him. He was clutching a glowing iPad tightly to his chest like a protective shield. His eyes were wide, sunken, and filled with an absolute agonizing fear. Those eyes tore right through my heart. I dropped the crowbar. The heavy steel clattered against the padded floor. I slowly dropped to my knees, holding my hands up with my palms open to show him I meant no harm. Susan let out a heart-wrenching sob and fell to her knees beside me. She reached out toward the boy, tears streaming down her face, whispering gentle, soothing words. But the boy did not speak. He just stared at us, his jaw clenched, making tiny, suppressed, whimpering sounds. The trauma he had endured was so severe that it had stolen his voice. My mind spun in a vortex of horror and rage. This was my son's house, the son I had raised, the son I had worked 80-hour weeks to put through college. He and his pristine country club wife had locked a starved, terrified child in their attic while they drank vintage wine in Italy. The betrayal was so absolute, so monstrous, that for a moment I could not even breathe. I wanted to smash the walls. I wanted to tear the entire estate down to the foundation. I slowly crawled forward, keeping my voice as calm and soft as possible. I told the boy he was safe. I told him nobody was going to hurt him ever again. He blinked, tears spilling over his dirty eyelashes, but he kept a death grip on that iPad. Before Susan could wrap her arms around his trembling shoulders, a sharp electronic beep pierced the silence of the room. I jolted upright and looked at the ceiling. Mounted high in the corner, perfectly camouflaged against the white paint, was a high-tech motorized security camera. A small red light had just blinked on, glowing like a demonic eye. The camera motor whirred softly as the lens rotated, zooming in directly on my face. Then a voice crackled through a hidden two-way speaker in the wall. It was not Connor. It was a voice I recognized instantly. Cold, arrogant, and dripping with corporate authority. It was Trent, Jessica's brother. Trent was a ruthless corporate defense attorney, the kind of man who made millions finding legal loopholes for corrupt executives. He despised me just as much as his sister did, always treating me like an uneducated peasant who was lucky to be allowed in their presence. His voice echoed through the sterile prison cell, completely devoid of human empathy. Harrison, step away from the asset immediately. The word asset hit me like a physical punch. He was not talking about a piece of real estate or a stock portfolio. He was talking about the starving 6-year-old boy shivering in the corner. Trent's voice continued smooth and threatening. "You are trespassing in a secure area. You have triggered a silent alarm. I strongly suggest you and Susan leave that room right now, go downstairs and wait quietly in the kitchen. Do not touch the boy. Do not attempt to communicate with him. The extraction team is 5 minutes out." I stood up slowly. I placed myself directly between the security camera and the little boy. Susan understood immediately. She scrambled forward and wrapped her arms around the child, pulling his fragile body against her chest. The boy buried his face in her shoulder and finally let out a loud, heartbreaking wail. I looked directly into the lens of the security camera. I did not yell. I did not curse. I channeled 40 years of hard, grinding labor, 40 years of dealing with predatory brokers and aggressive mechanics into one single resolute glare. I felt a righteous, burning indignation rising from the very bottom of my soul. I was a father and a grandfather, and I was looking at pure evil. I spoke to the camera in a low, dangerous tone. I told Trent that if anyone stepped foot on this property, if any extraction team tried to come through that front door, I would introduce them to my crowbar. I told him I was not an ignorant old man he could intimidate with legal jargon. Trent laughed through the speaker. It was a dry, hollow sound. "You have no idea what you are interfering with, Harrison. You are out of your depth. That child is a legal liability. Connor and Jessica gave me full power of attorney to handle this situation while they are abroad. If you do not walk out of that room right now, I will have you arrested for breaking and entering property damage and the kidnapping of a minor. You will spend your golden years rotting in a federal cell." I did not back down. I felt the absolute clarity of a man who knows exactly what he has to do. The illusion of my perfect son and his perfect life was dead. It was shattered into a million unfixable pieces. I realized then that I was not just facing a cruel daughter-in-law or a greedy son. I was facing a systemic, calculated machine of abuse, and they thought they held all the cards. They thought they had the power, the money, and the legal authority to crush me into submission. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I stared at the blinking red light. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my heavy pocket knife, and told Trent to send his team. Then I walked over to the wall, jammed the blade into the seam of the intercom panel, and ripped the wiring straight out of the drywall. The speaker let out a sharp squeal and went dead. The red light on the camera flickered and died. The room fell into a heavy, terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of the little boy crying into my wife's shoulder. I looked at Susan. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she was holding that child with the fierce, unyielding grip of a mother. I told her to gather the boy and whatever belongings were in this wretched room. We were not going to run. We were not going to wait in the kitchen to be intimidated by corporate thugs. I picked up my crowbar from the padded floor. The fight had come to my doorstep, and I was going to finish it. I was going to unearth every dark secret hiding in this multi-million-dollar fortress. I was going to tear my son's empire apart, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, until this little boy was safe, and the monsters who locked him in the dark were brought to absolute justice. I walked out of the attic and headed toward the main floor to barricade the heavy front doors. The war had just begun. Evil thrives when good people decide to look the other way to keep the peace. You reap exactly what you sow. If you stand with this grandfather's fight for justice, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of truth coming to light. And before you go, tell me in the comments what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now. I read every single one, and it brings me joy to know how far this story has reached. I left the suffocating air of the attic and marched down the grand, sweeping staircase of my son's multi-million-dollar estate. My heavy work boots left dusty prints on the pristine white runner rugs, and for the first time in my life, I did not care about tracking dirt into someone else's home. That house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. 40 years of running a commercial heavy-duty towing and diesel repair fleet had taught me a few hard lessons about human nature and survival. I had spent decades repossessing 18-wheelers in the dead of night, facing down desperate, angry men who thought they could intimidate me with threats and violence. You do not negotiate with a hostile element until you have completely secured your perimeter. Trent thought he was dealing with a naive old man who would tremble at the sound of legal jargon. He was severely mistaken. My first objective was the central nervous system of this sterile fortress. Connor had always bragged about his state-of-the-art smart home setup, how everything from the thermostat to the security cameras was routed through a central hub in the basement. I found the utility room behind a hidden panel in the media center. The walls were lined with blinking servers and fiber optic rotors. I did not bother looking for a password or a digital bypass. I reached into my tool belt, pulled out my heavy wire cutters, and went to work. I severed the main fiber optic hardline with a single decisive crunch. I smashed the primary Wi-Fi router against the concrete floor until the plastic casing splintered into pieces. I cut the power supply to the backup cellular transmitters. Within 3 minutes, the entire estate was completely offline. No more hidden cameras, no more remote access for Trent or Connor. They were blind. Next, I moved to the exterior. The property was surrounded by a 10-foot wrought iron fence, controlled by an electronic gate at the end of the long driveway. I walked out into the humid afternoon air, went straight to the gate's mechanical housing, and manually dropped the heavy steel emergency locking pins into the asphalt. I wrapped a thick logging chain from the bed of my pickup truck around the central pillars and secured it with a heavy brass padlock I always carried for towing jobs. I turned the sprawling estate into an impenetrable bunker. Nobody was getting in, and nobody was taking that little boy away from me. I walked back inside, locking every deadbolt on the mahogany front doors. The silence of the massive house was deafening, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside my chest. I headed back upstairs to the master suite where Susan had taken the child. When I pushed the bedroom door open, I found Susan sitting on the edge of the plush, king-sized bed. She had wrapped the boy in a thick, warm blanket. She had managed to wipe the grime from his face with a warm washcloth, and he was holding a glass of milk with both of his tiny, trembling hands. He looked so incredibly fragile, like a strong breeze could break his bones. Yet even in his exhausted, terrified state, he kept that glowing iPad pressed firmly against his chest. It was his anchor, his only connection to whatever reality he had been allowed to have. I knelt down slowly, making sure to keep myself lower than his eye level so I would not appear threatening. I asked him softly if I could look at his tablet. He flinched, his eyes darting to Susan, as if asking for permission. She nodded gently, giving him an encouraging, tearful smile. With trembling fingers, he slowly handed the device over to me. I took the iPad and sat in the armchair across from the bed. The interface was heavily restricted, locked down with parental controls that hid the web browser and the App Store. There were only a few basic educational games and a limited communication board designed for non-verbal children. My heart ached, realizing they had isolated him so thoroughly that he had to rely on a machine just to express basic human needs. But Connor had always been arrogant, and arrogant men make careless mistakes. He assumed an old mechanic like me barely knew how to operate a smartphone, let alone dig through a restricted file system. I bypassed the main screen by accessing the local storage folders through a back door in the device settings. I had learned how to troubleshoot complicated electronic logging devices on commercial trucks for years. A consumer tablet was child's play. I dug through the hidden local files and found a folder labeled simply with a string of numbers. I opened it and the screen populated with scanned documents. The first file was a comprehensive medical evaluation. The header bore the logo of a private, highly expensive pediatric clinic in the city. The patient name, printed in bold black letters, was Leo. My breath hitched. Leo. The boy had a name. He was not an asset. He was Leo. I scanned the medical notes. The documents detailed severe psychological trauma, profound malnutrition, and induced mutism resulting from prolonged isolation. The clinical language was sterile, but the reality it described was pure evil. Then I opened the next file. It was a scanned copy of a birth certificate. My hands began to shake as my eyes traced the lines of text. The father listed on the legal document was Connor Caldwell, my son. The monster who had locked this child in the dark was his own flesh and blood. But it was the mother's name that made the room spin around me. Sarah Miller. The memories flooded back with overwhelming clarity. Sarah Miller had been Connor's girlfriend during his first 2 years of college. She was a sweet, brilliant, and incredibly kind girl from a working-class family in Ohio. Susan and I had loved her. We thought she grounded Connor, bringing out a humility in him that we had tried so hard to instill. But then Connor met Jessica. Jessica came from generational wealth, dripping with country club elitism and ruthless ambition. Jessica had demanded Connor cut all ties with his past, including Sarah, if he wanted to enter her elite circle. Connor broke Sarah's heart and abandoned her just before his senior year. We never saw her again. I stared at the little boy on the bed. Leo was my grandson. He was my own blood. Connor had fathered a child with Sarah, hidden him from the world, and then somehow gained custody only to lock him away like a shameful secret, because Jessica could not tolerate a child that did not fit her flawless high society aesthetic. The magnitude of their cruelty was incomprehensible. They had stripped my grandson of his voice, his freedom, and his mother. Before I could process the agonizing grief of that revelation, a heavy blaring horn sounded from the front gate. I looked out the second-story window. A black armored SUV was idling aggressively against the iron gates I had chained shut. 3 men stepped out. 2 of them were massive, broad-shouldered private security contractors wearing tactical vests. The third man was Trent. He was wearing his expensive designer suit, looking furious as he realized his remote access to the house was completely gone, and his physical access was blocked by a logging chain. I handed the iPad back to Susan. I told her to lock the bedroom door from the inside and not to open it for anyone but me. I grabbed my crowbar and walked downstairs. I stepped out the front doors and walked down the long, manicured driveway. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders, but my blood was ice cold. I stopped about 10 feet from the iron gates, resting the heavy steel crowbar casually against my leg. Trent gripped the iron bars, his face twisted in a snarl of arrogant rage. He demanded I open the gate immediately. He said I was violating federal law, interfering with private security, and trespassing on property I did not own. He spoke fast, throwing out penal codes and civil statutes designed to overwhelm and panic a normal person. I did not flinch. I just stood there staring at him with the quiet, dangerous patience of a man who has nothing left to lose. When he realized I was not moving to unlock the chain, Trent raised his voice, pointing a manicured finger through the bars. He told me that if I did not release the child into his custody right this second, he was going to call the local police. He promised to have me arrested for the kidnapping of a minor and felony property destruction. He said his firm would ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life in a state penitentiary, while Susan was thrown into a psychiatric ward for participating in the abduction. I let him finish his little speech. The two security contractors stood behind him, with their hands resting near their tactical belts, trying to look intimidating. I have dealt with cartel enforcers at impound lots who were scarier than these corporate thugs. I took a slow step forward until I was right in front of the gate, looking Trent dead in his cold, soulless eyes. I told him to go ahead and make the call. I pulled my own cell phone from my pocket and held it up. I offered to dial the emergency dispatch for him if his fingers were too delicate. I told him I would absolutely love for the police to arrive at this estate. I wanted the authorities to walk through those doors. I wanted them to see the padded room with the deadbolt on the outside. I wanted them to smell the squalor in that attic. I wanted them to look at the starved, traumatized 6-year-old boy who happened to be my biological grandson. Trent's jaw tightened. The smug confidence began to drain from his face, replaced by a flicker of genuine panic. I kept my voice low, but every word was a hammer strike. I told him I also wanted the police to hear the security footage. I reminded him that before I ripped his expensive camera out of the ceiling, it had recorded his voice. It had recorded a prominent corporate defense attorney commanding me to step away from an abused child he referred to as an asset. I told him I was going to hand the police his voice, the boy's medical records, and the chain of custody proving exactly what he and my son had been doing. I asked him how his elite law firm would handle the public relations nightmare of their top partner running a cover-up for child abuse. Trent swallowed hard. The color completely left his face. He knew I had him cornered. He was a creature of legal loopholes and hidden documents, and I had just threatened to drag him into the blinding light of a public criminal investigation. The two security contractors looked at each other clearly, realizing that whatever job they had been hired for, it was rapidly crossing the line into a massive federal felony. Trent took a step back from the gate. He tried to compose his features, smoothing the lapels of his expensive jacket, but his hands were shaking. He pointed a finger at me, his voice dropping the shouting tone and adopting a venomous, quiet threat. He told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. He promised me that I did not understand the financial machinery I was trying to disrupt, and that by the time he and Connor returned from Europe, they would unleash a legal hellfire that would strip me of everything I owned. I gripped the crowbar and told him to bring the fire. I told him I had spent 40 years building things that last, and I was more than ready to tear his entire world apart. Trent turned sharply, got back into the black SUV, and ordered his men to drive. I watched the vehicle speed away, disappearing down the tree-lined suburban road. They were retreating, but I knew it was only temporary. They were going to regroup, call Connor in Italy, and try to find a way to crush me legally. They thought they could outsmart me because they had law degrees and million-dollar bank accounts. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had woken up a grandfather who had just found out his blood was being tortured. I turned around and walked back up the driveway toward the house, my mind already locking on to my next target. I needed to breach Connor's home office. I needed to follow the money, find out what happened to Sarah Miller, and uncover exactly why my son was willing to lock his own child in the dark to protect his empire. The siege of the estate had been won, but the war for Leo's soul had just begun. The sound of the armored vehicle speeding away down the long asphalt driveway left a hollow ringing in my ears. I stood there for a long moment, letting the humid afternoon breeze cool the sweat on the back of my neck. I had won the initial skirmish, but the battlefield was still rigged with hidden explosives. I turned my back to the heavy chained iron gates and walked up the front steps of that pristine suburban fortress. The polished marble floors felt like ice beneath my heavy leather work boots. I needed answers. I needed to understand how my own flesh and blood could morph into a monster capable of locking a terrified child in a padded cell. I climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase and made my way back to the master suite. I nudged the heavy bedroom door open just a fraction to check on my wife and my newly discovered grandson. Susan was sitting in the exact center of the massive king-sized bed. She had wrapped the little boy in a thick down comforter and was gently rocking him back and forth. The boy was still clutching his tablet to his chest, but his eyes were growing heavy. The sheer exhaustion of living in pure, constant terror had finally begun to catch up with him. Susan looked up at me and gave a slow, silent nod. She had him safe and secure. It was my job to establish our defensive perimeter and dig up the absolute truth. I closed the door quietly and walked down the wide, bright corridor toward the opposite wing of the house. Connor kept a private home office at the end of the hall. He had always been incredibly possessive of that space. Whenever Susan and I visited for holidays, he would lock that room down tighter than a federal bank vault. He would make arrogant jokes about corporate espionage and sensitive commercial real estate deals. I always thought he was just being dramatic. Now I knew those slick corporate jokes were just a smokescreen designed to hide a much darker reality. I reached the office door. It was made of solid reinforced oak and fitted with a high-tech biometric keypad that required both a fingerprint scan and a digital code. A younger man, or a desperate man, might have tried to hack the system or guess the passcode. But I spent over 40 years pulling wrecked 18-wheelers out of muddy ditches and rebuilding shattered diesel engines from the ground up. I knew from decades of hard-earned experience that the fanciest electronic security in the world was completely useless against a man who understood basic structural mechanics. I did not waste a single second playing with the digital keypad. I knelt down on the plush white carpet and examined the heavy brass hinges on the side of the doorframe. Connor had paid a small fortune for the electronic lock, but the private contractors had skimped on the frame installation. The hinge pins were exposed and slightly loose. I reached into my trusty tool belt and pulled out a flathead screwdriver and a heavy steel wrench. I wedged the flat edge of the screwdriver beneath the bottom hinge pin and gave it a solid upward strike with the heavy wrench. The brass pin popped loose with a sharp metallic clack. I repeated the exact same process on the top and middle hinges, sliding the thick brass cylinders out of their housings one by one. With the pins completely removed, I simply gripped the heavy oak door by the edge and pulled it backward toward my chest. The entire heavy slab of wood detached from the frame, completely bypassing the expensive biometric lock. I leaned the heavy door gently against the hallway wall and stepped inside my son's private sanctum. The office was immaculate. It looked like a staged photograph from a luxury architectural magazine. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with pristine leather-bound volumes that looked like they had never been opened or read. A massive glass desk sat in the very center of the room, overlooking the manicured backyard and the extravagant swimming pool. But I was not interested in the superficial decorations or the expensive furniture. My eyes locked onto a row of brushed steel filing cabinets tucked into the far shadowed corner of the room. I walked over to the cabinets. They were locked tightly with modern magnetic internal seals. Once again, Connor had relied on expensive electronics to guard his most toxic secrets. I slid the flattened edge of my steel crowbar into the narrow gap between the top drawer and the steel frame. I applied steady downward pressure, utilizing the exact leverage principles I had used 1,000 times on the garage floor to pry open crushed truck doors. The steel cabinet groaned and shrieked under the immense physical force. With one final heavy downward thrust, the internal locking mechanism snapped and broke. The top drawer slid open smoothly on its metal tracks. I started pulling out thick manila folders and stacking them aggressively on the glass desk. As I sifted through the endless stacks of papers, a sickening realization washed over me. Connor and his socialite wife lived in a world of absolute total illusion. They hosted lavish charity galas, they drove imported Italian sports cars, and they rubbed elbows with the local elite at their country club. They projected an image of invincible generational wealth. But the complex financial documents spread across the desk told a completely different and desperate story. They were drowning in an ocean of toxic, unforgiving debt. I found complex banking spreadsheets detailing massive high-interest margin loans taken out against commercial properties that were visibly hemorrhaging money. Connor had leveraged everything he owned, and things he did not even technically own, just to maintain the appearance of their lavish lifestyle. There were maxed-out corporate credit lines, final default notices from private equity firms, and threatening certified letters from aggressive collection agencies. Jessica had a separate heavy folder entirely dedicated to her personal luxury spending. She was dropping hundreds of thousands of dollars on seasonal designer wardrobes, exclusive country club membership fees, and lavish trips to private islands, while their actual liquid bank accounts hovered dangerously near zero. The pristine white marble mansion I was standing inside was nothing but a fragile, hollow shell. It was entirely financed by a precarious house of cards that was ready to collapse at any given second. I felt a massive surge of absolute disgust. I had worked my calloused fingers to the bone my entire life, saving every extra penny, building a secure future for my family through honest, grueling labor and sacrifice. Connor had chosen the pathetic path of greed and vanity. He was so desperate to look like a wealthy king that he had sold his soul to the highest bidder. But simple financial ruin did not explain the little boy locked in the dark, padded attic. Greed alone did not justify that specific level of calculated, monstrous cruelty. I dug deeper into the bottom drawer of the broken filing cabinet. Hidden securely beneath a thick stack of outdated tax returns, I found a massive black leather binder secured with a heavy rubber band. The white label on the spine was completely blank. I carried the heavy binder to the glass desk and opened it under the bright desk lamp. The very first document inside was an official state death certificate. The name printed across the top in cold black letters sent a fresh, agonizing wave of grief straight through my chest. Sarah Miller. I traced my rough fingers over the typed letters of her name. Sarah had been a bright, beautiful, kind young woman who truly loved my son back in his early college years. She was a good, honest girl from a hard-working, humble family in Ohio. Connor had dated her seriously for 2 years before he met Jessica. Jessica had immediately convinced him that Sarah was too common and too simple for the grand, elite life they were destined to build together. Connor broke Sarah's heart and walked away without looking back, abandoning her right before his senior year. I had not heard her sweet name in nearly 10 years. The death certificate stated she had died exactly 3 years ago in a brutal multi-car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside of Cleveland. She was pronounced dead at the scene. My heart ached for the sweet girl we had once welcomed into our home. But as I turned the heavy pages of the black binder, the sorrow quickly transmuted into a blazing, white, hot, violent fury. Following the tragic death certificate was a massive, dense legal portfolio detailing the establishment of a highly protected blind trust. I read through the complex legal jargon, slowly translating the corporate terms into plain reality. Sarah Miller had not come from a simple working-class background, as Connor had always arrogantly led us to believe. Her maternal grandparents were quiet, extremely wealthy old money investors who had built a massive regional logistics fortune in the Midwest. Upon Sarah's sudden and tragic death, That entire vast estate was liquidated and transferred directly into an irrevocable trust fund. The sole beneficiary of that 8-figure fortune was her only living child, Leo. I stared at the staggering numbers printed on the official bank statements. Tens of millions of dollars sitting in secure, high-yield accounts intended to guarantee that little boy a lifetime of absolute security medical care and comfort. The scattered pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with sickening crystal clarity. I found the sealed court transcripts from a bitter closed-door custody battle that took place shortly after Sarah passed away. Connor had never been a part of Leo's life. He had completely abandoned Sarah when she got pregnant, choosing Jessica and her superficial country club status over his own flesh and blood. But the exact moment Connor discovered the existence of that massive 8-figure trust fund, he suddenly decided to play the role of the grieving, devoted, and loving father. He hired ruthless, expensive corporate litigators. He used his superficial wealth and his pristine suburban mansion to paint a fraudulent picture of a perfect, stable home environment. He fought Sarah's grieving extended family tooth and nail in court. And because he was the biological father and possessed the appearance of immense wealth, the flawed legal system sided with him. The courts granted Connor full permanent custody of little Leo. But much more importantly, they appointed my son as the primary financial guardian and sole executor of the child's massive trust fund. He did not fight for custody out of love or a sudden sense of paternal duty or guilt. He sued for that little boy because his real estate empire was drowning in toxic debt, and Leo was his $50 million life raft. I flipped to the very back of the heavy binder and found a hidden ledger filled with handwritten notes and untraceable cash receipts. These pages detailed the absolute darkest part of their monstrous plan. Jessica had been furious about the custody arrangement. She despised the memory of Sarah, and she absolutely refused to let a traumatized, grieving child ruin her carefully curated social aesthetic. Leo was not a quiet, easy accessory that she could show off to her wealthy elite friends. He was broken. He carried the heavy, devastating emotional scars of losing his mother in a violent crash. He had stopped speaking entirely. He required immense patience, deep love, and specialized pediatric care. Jessica and Connor had absolutely no interest in providing any of that. The handwritten ledger showed monthly cash withdrawals used to pay an undocumented, uncredentialed private nanny. They had intentionally hired someone desperate and completely off the grid. Someone who could not speak English well and who would never dare go to the police or the authorities. They moved Leo into the isolated attic, out of sight and out of mind, so his crying would not disturb their dinner parties. They paid this shadow nanny a miserable cash wage to keep the boy quiet, feed him basic scraps, and ensure he never wandered into the main pristine living areas of the house. The final entry in the dark ledger was dated just 5 days ago. The nanny had fled the estate. The frantic notes indicated she had demanded more money because the boy was getting dangerously sick and losing weight. When Connor, arrogant as always, refused her demands, she packed her bags and vanished in the middle of the night. Instead of seeking professional medical help or stepping up to actually care for his own sick child, my son and his cruel wife simply locked the heavy deadbolt on the outside of the attic door. They packed their expensive designer luggage called a private car and boarded a first-class flight to Tuscany. They deliberately left a 6-year-old boy to starve in the dark while they drank expensive vintage champagne on a luxury European vacation that was financed by the very trust fund money they were illegally stealing from him. I stood up slowly from the glass desk. My breathing was heavy and ragged, echoing in the silent, sterile room. I felt physically, violently sick. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be a genuinely good man, setting an example of hard, honest work integrity and basic human decency. I had sacrificed my own personal comfort my entire life so my son could have every educational advantage in the world. And this was what he had ultimately become. A ruthless parasite. A monster who viewed his own traumatized child as nothing more than a bank account waiting to be drained dry. I looked at the thick stack of undeniable evidence I had just unearthed. Trent, the slick corporate lawyer, had actually thought he could intimidate me by threatening me with the local police. He thought he could bury these dark corporate secrets under layers of complex legal threats and aggressive private security contractors. But Trent had made a fatal, unrecoverable error. He assumed I would play by his polite society rules. He assumed I would panic fold under pressure and try to negotiate a quiet, private surrender just to save my family name from a public scandal. I did not care about the family name anymore. I cared about the little boy currently clinging to my weeping wife in the master bedroom. I carefully and methodically gathered every single document spread across the glass desk. I placed the death certificate, the blind trust agreements, the margin loan statements, and the shadow cash ledger back into the black binder. I secured it tightly under my arm, holding it like a loaded weapon. My son had built a massive fortress of lies to protect his stolen financial empire, but he had foolishly left the front door open for the one man who knew exactly how to tear it all down. I walked out of the pristine office, leaving the broken, heavy mahogany door leaning carelessly against the wall. The investigation was officially over. It was time to go to war. The black leather binder felt heavier than an engine block under my arm. My cell phone sat in my front pocket, practically burning a hole through the denim. Every instinct built into my weary bones screamed at me to pull it out and dial Connor. I wanted to call that luxury hotel in Tuscany. I wanted to hear his arrogant, polished voice answer, oblivious to the fact that his father was standing inside his ruined sanctuary. I wanted to scream until my throat was raw. I wanted to demand how he could lock his own flesh and blood in a padded cell. But screaming is a weak man's tactic. Noise only alerts the prey that the hunter is in the woods. If I yelled at my son over a transatlantic phone line, I would simply be handing Trent all the warning he needed to destroy the evidence. Instead of making noise, I weaponized my silence. For decades, my son and his high society wife treated me like a simple, penniless grease monkey. They thought my life amounted to nothing more than dirty fingernails and rusted tow cables. They entirely missed the fact that a man who runs a regional commercial logistics and recovery fleet learns a few things about moving heavy objects and burying absolute garbage. When I sold my company a few years back, I walked away with a mountain of quiet, liquid wealth. I never bought a country club membership or an imported sports car. I kept my assets entirely out of the public eye. Connor had no idea the kind of financial firepower I was holding. He thought I was relying on a fixed pension. He did not realize I had the capital to hire an army. I sat down on the bottom step of the grand staircase and opened my phone. I bypassed my son's contact profile and scrolled down until I found a very specific number. Elias Vance. Elias was a ferocious trust and estate litigator. He was a ruthless corporate shark who wore bespoke suits and billed by the minute. Most ordinary people would never even make it past his receptionist. But years ago, Elias ran a high-end fleet of executive transport vehicles for his law firm, and I was the only mechanic in the tri-state area who serviced his limousines with total honesty. I saved him hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent repair claims over the years. We shared a mutual respect built on absolute competence. I dialed his direct line. He answered on the second ring, his tone sharp and professional. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed his absolute best people right this second. I told him I was standing inside my son's house, holding a stolen blind trust portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars, and that I had just pulled my starved, traumatized 6-year-old grandson out of a dead-bolted attic. The line went completely silent for a few seconds. Elias was a man who had seen every level of corporate greed, but the sheer cruelty of the situation left even him speechless. When his voice returned, the smooth lawyer persona was gone, replaced by a cold, tactical edge. He told me not to speak to anyone else, not to answer any calls from Trent, and to get the child off the property immediately. Elias knew exactly how men like Trent operated. He warned me that Trent would absolutely try to frame this as a kidnapping. A wealthy lawyer could easily manipulate the local police into believing a confused grandfather had suffered a mental breakdown and abducted a child. We needed an impenetrable shield. Elias told me to drive to a private medical facility on the north side of the city. He was personally calling in a favor from a top-tier pediatric trauma specialist who operated entirely outside of Trent's sphere of influence. We needed to create a legally binding medical record of the neglect before Trent could spin his web of lies. I walked back up to the master bedroom. Susan was still rocking the boy, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I knelt beside the bed and told her we were leaving. I told her to wrap Leo tightly in the heaviest blanket she could find and to keep his face shielded from the bright sunlight. He had been locked in that dark room for so long that the afternoon glare would be terrifying for him. Susan lifted him into her arms. He weighed practically nothing. My heart shattered all over again, seeing how easily my wife carried a 6-year-old boy. We walked out the front doors and moved quickly down the long driveway toward my pickup truck. I unlocked the heavy chain at the gate just long enough to drive through, then secured it right back. As we drove away from that white marble prison, I looked at Leo in the rearview mirror. He was pressing his face into Susan's shoulder, clutching his tablet, completely overwhelmed by the sudden movement and the noise of the outside world. He did not make a single sound. His silence was the loudest, most devastating accusation against my son I could possibly imagine. We arrived at the private clinic 30 minutes later. It was a discreet, heavily secured building surrounded by tall evergreen trees. Elias was already waiting for us in the private parking garage, flanked by 2 serious-looking men holding thick leather briefcases. Elias did not offer a polite handshake. He simply looked at the fragile boy in Susan's arms, his jaw tightening with an unspoken fury. He guided us through a private back entrance directly into a sterile, quiet examination room. The pediatric specialist was a gentle, gray-haired woman named Dr. Aris. She did not rush. She did not wear a white coat that might frighten the boy. She spoke in soft, measured tones, slowly earning enough trust to gently examine his small, bruised body. Susan and I stood in the corner of the room holding our breath as the doctor systematically documented the nightmare. The process was agonizing to watch. Every discovery felt like a physical blow to my chest. Dr. Aris noted the profound muscle atrophy in his legs from extreme confinement. She documented deep, dark bruises along his ribcage and severe vitamin deficiencies. But the most damning evidence was psychological. When she tried to gently test his vocal responses, Leo simply curled into a tighter ball, covering his ears and squeezing his eyes shut. Dr. Aris looked at me, her expression a mix of deep sorrow and professional resolve. She stated that the boy was suffering from severe induced trauma and prolonged sensory deprivation. Elias stood by the door taking meticulous notes. Dr. Aris generated a comprehensive, legally binding medical affidavit right there on the spot. She officially classified the situation as extreme child endangerment and severe physical neglect. She signed the documents, stamping them with her medical credentials. Elias took the heavy file and looked at me. He said we now possessed an absolute bulletproof shield. If Trent attempted to send the police after us, this medical evaluation would immediately trigger a massive felony investigation against Connor and Jessica. We had legally secured the innocent. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of relief. We had the boy, we had the medical proof, and we had the financial documents. I thought the hardest part of the battle was behind us. I severely underestimated the absolute depravity of the people we were fighting. We took Leo back to our own modest, quiet home on the edge of town. Susan prepared a warm, soft meal, coaxing the boy to eat tiny spoonfuls of chicken broth while he sat huddled on our living room sofa. The house was quiet, peaceful, and filled with a warmth that sterile suburban mansion never possessed. I sat at my kitchen table drinking a cup of black coffee, watching my wife soothe the grandson we never knew we had. Then my phone rang. It was Elias. His voice was grim, stripped of all the tactical confidence he had shown at the clinic. He told me Trent had just executed a terrifying backdoor legal maneuver. Trent had not gone to the local police to report a kidnapping. He knew the police would eventually uncover the attic. Instead, Trent had bypassed standard law enforcement entirely and went straight to a corrupt civil judge whom he regularly played golf with. Utilizing his immense corporate influence, Trent had filed an emergency ex parte injunction against Susan and me. I asked Elias what the injunction meant. The answer made the blood freeze in my veins. Trent had submitted heavily fabricated documents claiming that I was suffering from severe late-stage dementia-induced paranoia. He alleged that Susan and I had suffered a shared psychotic break, broken into our son's home, and violently abducted a deeply disturbed, legally adopted child who required specialized institutional care. Because Trent possessed Connor's power of attorney, he was acting as the boy's legal proxy. The corrupt judge had signed an emergency order demanding the immediate surrender of the child and mandating an involuntary psychiatric hold for both me and my wife. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table so hard my knuckles turned white. Trent was not just trying to take the boy back. He was trying to erase us entirely. He was going to use the legal system to lock Susan and me in a psychiatric ward, stripping us of our credibility, our freedom, and our ability to testify. He was going to bury the truth under a mountain of fabricated medical claims and judicial corruption. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window, staring out into the dark yard. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I was not just fighting my greedy son or a cruel daughter-in-law. I was fighting a massive systemic machine. It was a machine built by the wealthy, designed to protect the wealthy at any cost. They had the connections, the judges, and the power to turn reality completely upside down. They could starve a child in a locked attic, and the system would still protect them while punishing the people who tried to stop it. Elias spoke through the phone, breaking the heavy silence. He asked me what I wanted to do. He offered to negotiate a surrender, to perhaps broker a deal that would keep me and Susan out of a psychiatric facility if we handed over the trust documents. He warned me that fighting a signed judicial order was incredibly dangerous and could result in federal charges. I looked back at the living room. Leo was finally asleep, his small, fragile head resting on Susan's lap. My wife was gently stroking his hair, tears silently falling down her cheeks. They had taken so much from this innocent boy. They had robbed him of his mother, his voice, and his basic human dignity. They were not going to take us from him too. I brought the phone back to my ear. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that comes from a lifetime of hard labor and absolute conviction. I told Elias that I was not surrendering. I told him I did not care how many corrupt judges Trent played golf with, or how many millions of dollars my son had stolen. I instructed Elias to deploy every single dollar in my portfolio. I told him to hire the most aggressive federal investigators, private auditors, and appellate lawyers money could buy. We were going to bypass the local courts entirely and take this war to the federal level. I promised that before this was over, I would dismantle that systemic machine piece by piece. I would expose the rot hiding behind their country club memberships and their luxury suits. They thought they could use their wealth to crush a retired mechanic. They were about to learn what happens when a father decides to tear his own son's empire down to the bare, ugly dirt. I hung up the phone and walked back into the living room. The soft glow of a small table lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Susan looked up at me, sensing the heavy shift in my posture. She asked me what was wrong, her voice trembling slightly with the lingering fear of the day. I sat down beside her, gently placing my calloused hand over hers. I explained Trent's legal maneuver. I watched the color drain from her face as she processed the sheer malice of their plan. The idea that our own son would allow his lawyer brother-in-law to falsely label us as mentally incompetent just to protect a stolen fortune was a betrayal too deep to measure. But Susan was a woman of immense strength. She had stood by my side through decades of grueling financial hardship before we finally found success. She had weathered every storm life had thrown at us with unwavering grace. She looked down at the sleeping boy, then back up at me. Her eyes hardened with a fierce maternal resolve. She told me we were not going to let them win. She told me to use every asset we had to burn their lies to the ground. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark kitchen, surrounded by the stolen financial documents from Connor's office. I reviewed the bank statements, the margin loans, and the blind trust portfolio until my eyes burned. Every line of data was a testament to my son's absolute moral bankruptcy. I was no longer just a grandfather trying to save a child. I was a man dismantling a criminal enterprise. I mapped out the financial connections, preparing the ammunition Elias would need for the coming days. The legal weaponization of my wealth had officially begun, and I was absolutely ready to bring the entire corrupt system crashing down on their heads. The silence of the house pressed heavily against my ears. I thought about the sheer arrogance of Trent's strategy. He assumed that because we lived in a modest home and dressed simply, we possessed no resources. He assumed the judicial system was his private playground. It is a common mistake among the elite. They confuse a quiet life with a powerless life. They believe that wearing a bespoke suit and carrying a leather briefcase automatically grants them superiority over those who build the world with their hands. I picked up the medical affidavit Dr. Aris had signed. The sterile clinical description of Leo's suffering was a heavy anchor grounding my resolve. This single piece of paper was the key to shattering Trent's false narrative. While Trent was busy filing emergency injunctions based on fabricated psychological claims, we held the empirical scientific truth. But truth alone is rarely enough when fighting deep pockets and established corruption. Truth requires a delivery mechanism. It requires relentless, overwhelming pressure to break through the walls of systemic privilege. I poured myself another cup of black coffee, watching the first light of dawn begin to creep over the horizon. The sun was rising on a new, terrifying reality. The son I had loved, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball and drive a truck, was entirely gone. In his place was a hollow, greedy shell who would gladly lock me in a psychiatric ward to protect his stolen millions. The grief of losing my son was profound, but it was eclipsed by the urgent burning need to protect my grandson. I drafted a long, detailed message to Elias outlining the specific forensic financial paths I wanted his team to pursue. I wanted them to trace every single wire transfer from the blind trust. I wanted the routing numbers for the offshore accounts Jessica used to fund her luxury shopping sprees. I wanted a complete, exhaustive audit of Connor's commercial real estate holdings. We were not just going to fight the injunction. We were going to launch a massive multi-front legal assault that would leave them scrambling for cover. When morning finally arrived, I felt a deep, chilling calm. The shock and the horror of the previous day had burned away, leaving behind a cold, tactical focus. Trent wanted a war, and he was about to get one. I walked back into the living room. Leo was awake, sitting quietly on the sofa, staring at the sunlight streaming through the window. He looked at me, and for the very first time, I saw a tiny flickering spark of curiosity in his sunken eyes. He was no longer trying to press himself into the wall. He was beginning to realize that the monsters could not reach him here. I smiled at the boy, a genuine warm smile. I promised him silently that I would move heaven and earth to keep him safe. The machine of wealth and power that had tried to crush us was formidable, but it was built on lies. And lies, no matter how expensive or well-connected, cannot withstand the crushing weight of absolute, unwavering justice. The battle lines were drawn. The legal weapons were loaded. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you mistake a quiet father for a weak one. I sat in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of Elias Vance's downtown law firm. The sprawling mahogany table was completely covered with the files I had liberated from Connor's office. Elias had not wasted a single minute. He brought in a team of 4 forensic accountants. These were not your average tax preparers. They were financial predators, men and women, who specialized in hunting down hidden assets and unraveling complex corporate fraud. I watched them work with a deep, silent respect. They did not wear coveralls or carry grease guns, but their method was exactly the same as mine. They were dismantling an engine. They traced the financial fuel lines, isolated the corrupted valves, and exposed the dirty exhaust of my son's empire. It took them less than 48 hours to crack the entire scheme wide open. The level of sociopathic greed they uncovered made my stomach churn. The blind trust established by Sarah Miller's wealthy family was designed to be an impenetrable fortress for little Leo. It was meant to guarantee him a lifetime of absolute security, top-tier medical care, and specialized education. Connor had been granted financial guardianship by a judge who believed the illusion of his perfect suburban life. But my son had a fiduciary duty that he completely ignored. Instead, he treated his traumatized mute child's inheritance like a personal bottomless piggy bank. The lead accountant, a sharp woman with tired eyes, walked me through the routing numbers. Connor had been bleeding the trust dry to the tune of $9 million over the past 36 months. He desperately needed that massive influx of capital to prop up his sinking commercial real estate firm. His strip malls were completely vacant. His luxury condo developments were stalled by aggressive creditors. To cover his tracks and bypass the trust's oversight protocols, Connor had forged hundreds of detailed invoices. He created phantom billing records from fake private pediatric clinics, elite therapeutic boarding schools, and specialized trauma counselors. He submitted paperwork claiming he was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars a month on Leo's recovery. He generated fake progress reports and fabricated medical receipts. But every single cent was actually being funneled into dummy corporations secretly owned by Jessica and her lawyer brother Trent. From there, the money was washed clean and injected directly into Connor's failing business accounts to satisfy his aggressive private equity lenders. The sheer depravity of it was staggering. They had locked a starving, terrified child in a dark, padded attic with a plastic bucket, all while generating pristine corporate receipts for world-class pediatric care. Every piece of paper they filed was a massive federal crime. They had committed wire fraud, bank fraud, grand embezzlement, and tax evasion on a breathtaking scale. Elias looked at the mountain of highlighted evidence and told me we had more than enough ammunition to put Connor, Jessica, and Trent away for decades. We did not just have a theory. We had the absolute, undeniable smoking gun. Elias did not wait for Trent to make another move. He took the forensic audit and the bulletproof medical affidavit from Dr. Eris and filed an emergency sealed petition with a federal judge. We completely bypassed the corrupt local courts where Trent played golf with the magistrates. We went straight to the federal level, presenting undeniable proof of massive financial crimes crossing state and international lines. The federal judge took one look at the evidence of child endangerment and trust embezzlement and brought the hammer down. By Tuesday morning, the judge signed an order that immediately froze every single asset tied to Connor, Jessica, and Trent. The trust accounts were locked down entirely. The corporate banking lines were frozen. Their personal platinum credit cards were instantly suspended. The financial oxygen to Connor's fraudulent empire was cut off in a single devastating stroke. With the trap firmly snapped shut, there was nothing left to do but wait. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping a hot cup of black coffee. The house was quiet and peaceful. In the living room, Susan was sitting on the floor with Leo. The boy was slowly building a small tower out of brightly colored wooden blocks. He was clean, he was fed, and for the first time in his life, he was safe. The contrast between the peace inside my home and the storm I had just unleashed on my son was heavy, but my conscience was completely clear. Then my cell phone vibrated against the wooden table. The screen lit up with an international caller ID. The location read Tuscany, Italy. It was Connor. I let it ring 3 times. I took a deep, steadying breath, bringing my heart rate down to a slow, methodical rhythm. I was not talking to my boy anymore. I was talking to the man who had tortured my grandson for profit. I picked up the phone, pressed the green button, and simply said his name. Connor sounded frantic. The polished, arrogant real estate mogul I knew was entirely gone. He was hyperventilating his words, stumbling over each other in a pathetic, desperate rush. He demanded to know what I had done. He said he was standing in the lobby of a luxury hotel in Florence, and every single one of his credit cards had been declined. He said the hotel management was threatening to call the Italian police because his banking institutions were reporting his accounts as locked by federal order. He was panicking, demanding to know why Trent was not answering his urgent calls. Then the manipulation began. Connor started to weep through the receiver. It was a practiced, sickening display of fake emotion. He told me I did not understand the immense pressure he was under. He sobbed, claiming that the commercial real estate market had unexpectedly crashed, that he was just trying to protect our family legacy, and that the money he took from Leo's trust was just a temporary loan to tide him over. He swore on his life that he was going to put every single dollar back as soon as his next development project closed. He begged me to call off the lawyers, to withdraw the federal freeze, and to keep this quiet and inside the family. He told me I was ruining his entire life over a simple misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. He had locked his own flesh and blood in a dark cell to starve, and he dared to call it a misunderstanding. I did not raise my voice. I let him cry. I let him spin his pathetic, transparent web of excuses. When he finally realized his tears were crashing against a solid wall of absolute silence, his tone violently shifted. The weeping stopped instantly. The mask slipped, and a vicious, snarling rage took over. Connor bared his true teeth. He screamed into the phone the audio clipping from the sheer volume of his fury. He told me I was a foolish, uneducated old man who had stepped way out of his lane. He threatened to absolutely destroy Susan and me. He bragged that he had already instructed Trent to file the psychiatric injunctions. He promised that by the time he landed back in the States, Susan and I would be strapped to hospital beds in a state-run mental facility. He threatened to use his corporate lawyers to seize my small home, to drain my modest retirement accounts, and to leave us destitute and rotting on the street. He said I had no idea how the real world worked, that power and money always won, and that a washed-up, dirty-handed mechanic could never defeat a corporate empire. I listened to every single threat. I let his venom pour through the speaker until he finally ran out of breath, panting heavily into the phone. The silence stretched out over the transatlantic line, heavy and thick. I looked over at little Leo, who had stopped playing with his blocks and was watching me with wide, fearful eyes. I offered the boy a gentle, reassuring nod. Then I brought the phone back to my mouth. I spoke with a voice that was cold, deep, and completely devoid of any fatherly warmth. I told Connor that he was right about one thing. I was a mechanic. I had spent 40 years covered in grease rebuilding shattered diesel blocks and hauling wrecked steel out of ditches. I told him I knew exactly how complex machines worked. I knew that if you pull the right pin drain, the right fluid, and cut the main fuel line, even the most massive, intimidating machine in the world will grind to a violent, irreversible halt. I told him that the uneducated old man he always looked down on was the exact same man who had just dismantled his entire life. I informed him that Trent's corrupt psychiatric injunction was dead on arrival. I told him about the pediatric trauma specialist who had secured the boy. I told him about Elias Vance and the team of forensic accountants. I told him that the federal government was currently reviewing the $9 million he had stolen from his own traumatized son. I made sure he understood that there was no local judge he could bribe, no slick lawyer he could hide behind, and no amount of money that could save him now because his money was already gone. I told him the blind trust was locked down. I told him his corporate accounts were seized by federal mandate. I told him he was utterly and completely bankrupt. Connor tried to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless stammer came out. The crushing reality of his absolute ruin was hitting him thousands of miles away. I delivered my final words with brutal precision. I told him that he had built a life on stolen money and human suffering, and that the diesel mechanic he despised was currently burning his glass castle to the bare dirt. I told him to enjoy his last few hours of freedom in Italy, because the moment his feet touched American soil, the federal authorities would be waiting. Connor let out a panicked, terrifying gasp. He begged me to wait, pleading with me to just listen to reason. I pressed the end button and set the phone face down on the table. The monster was terrified, scrambling to book a desperate charter flight back to a home he no longer owned. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the final reckoning was moving perfectly into place. The morning after I hung up the phone with my son, the silence in our home was heavy and dense. I had severed Connor and Jessica from their stolen millions and frozen their financial empire with a single federal order. I knew they were panicking in Italy, completely cut off from their banks and their credit lines. I expected them to lash out. I expected legal threats and aggressive posturing from Trent. What I did not anticipate was the sheer speed and venom of the psychological warfare they were about to unleash on my wife and me. Trent and Jessica realized they could not win the financial battle from across the Atlantic. They could not magically unfreeze the accounts Elias had locked down. So they pivoted to the only currency they had left to spend. They weaponized their social influence. In the manicured, pristine world of high society, suburban living perception is everything. The truth does not matter nearly as much as who tells the best story first. Jessica and Trent were absolute masters of spinning fiction into undisputed fact. They could not use the law to crush me, so they decided to use our own community. The retaliation began before the sun even fully rose over our quiet neighborhood. The assault did not come in the form of a physical threat. It came through the relentless, deafening ringing of our home telephone. It started with a call from a woman named Barbara, a longtime member of our local congregation, and someone Susan considered a close friend for nearly 2 decades. I answered the kitchen phone while pouring my first cup of black coffee. Barbara did not offer a polite greeting. Her voice was sharp, dripping with a sickening mixture of pity and accusation. She told me that she was praying for my mental health. She said the entire church community was deeply disturbed to hear about my sudden tragic decline into dementia. I stood there gripping the plastic receiver, my brow furrowing in absolute confusion. I asked her what on earth she was talking about. Barbara let out a dramatic, condescending sigh. She told me that Jessica had just posted a tearful, heartbreaking video to her private social club groups and the church prayer circle. According to Jessica, my wife and I had suffered a shared psychotic break. Jessica claimed that Leo was not Connor's biological son from a past relationship, but a deeply disturbed, violent orphan they had secretly adopted to save from the foster system. She spun a fabricated, highly detailed tragedy about how the boy suffered from aggressive behavioral disorders that required him to be kept in a specialized, padded therapeutic environment for his own safety and the safety of others. The lies were staggering. Jessica told the entire community that Connor had begged me to stay away from the boy because my declining cognitive state made me unpredictable. She wept on camera, claiming that my dementia had caused me to hallucinate a kidnapping scenario. She told hundreds of our neighbors that I had violently broken into her home, assaulted her private medical staff, and dragged a severely disabled child into a dangerous situation out of sheer senile paranoia. Trent had backed up her claims using his polished reputation as a corporate attorney to lend absolute credibility to the narrative. They had painted me not as a savior, but as a dangerous, confused old man who belonged in a locked psychiatric ward. I hung up the phone on Barbara without saying another word. But the phone did not stop ringing. The red light on the answering machine began to blink frantically as the voicemail filled up with messages. My extended family started calling. My own cousins, nieces, and nephews, people I had lent money to and helped fix their cars for decades, were leaving concerned, judging messages. They suggested I surrender the child back to Trent and check myself into a facility before I did something I would regret. The local country club wives started calling Susan on her mobile phone, leaving passive-aggressive voicemails demanding we return the poor, sick child to his loving parents. They were isolating us. It was a classic ruthless tactic designed to break our spirit. Trent knew he could not defeat the medical evidence in a federal courtroom, so he decided to destroy our reputation in the court of public opinion. He wanted to make us absolute pariahs. He wanted us to feel so overwhelmed, so hated, and so completely alone that we would surrender the boy just to make the social nightmare stop. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the voicemails playing one after another. I felt a cold, righteous anger burning in my chest. These were people who had eaten at our dinner table. These were neighbors I had pulled out of snowbanks in the dead of winter with my tow trucks. The moment a wealthy socialite shed a few fake tears and threw out the word dementia, they all instantly turned their backs on a lifetime of friendship. They chose the comfortable, polished lie over the messy, ugly reality. I walked into the living room. Susan was sitting in her favorite floral armchair, staring blankly at her glowing cell phone. Her face was pale, and her eyes were brimming with tears. I could see the physical toll the smear campaign was taking on her. Susan was a woman who valued her community deeply. She had spent the last 30 years organizing charity bake sales, teaching Sunday school, and dropping off casseroles for sick neighbors. Her reputation was built on decades of quiet, humble kindness. Seeing her name dragged through the mud, hearing her oldest friends leave voicemails accusing her of enabling a violent abduction, was breaking her heart. She looked up at me, her lower lip trembling. She told me Reverend Thomas had just sent her an email. The pastor of our church, a man we had trusted for years, told Susan that perhaps it was best if we stepped away from the congregation while we sought the psychiatric help we so clearly needed. He offered to mediate a peaceful return of the child to Trent to avoid further legal trouble. The betrayal in Susan's voice was agonizing. She dropped her phone onto the coffee table and covered her face with her hands. She sobbed, asking how people who had known us our entire lives could believe such monstrous things. She asked how our own son could allow his wife to destroy our names just to cover his tracks. The weight of the isolation was crushing her. The elite suburban machine was working exactly as Trent had designed it. It was meant to suffocate us, to make us question our own sanity, and to force a surrender. I walked over to the armchair and knelt down right in front of my wife. I gently took her hands and pulled them away from her tear-stained face. I needed to pull her back from the edge of the emotional abyss. I needed to remind her exactly who we were and what we were fighting for. I did not offer her empty platitudes. I did not tell her that the neighbors would eventually see the truth, or that the church would apologize. I knew better than to rely on the conscience of a crowd that worshipped money and status. Instead, I stood up and walked over to my leather briefcase resting by the front door. I unbuckled the heavy brass clasps and pulled out the thick stack of documents Elias had given me. I brought the files back to the living room and spread them out across the wooden coffee table right over top of her buzzing cell phone. I pointed to the medical affidavit signed by Dr. Aris. I made Susan look at the clinical photographs of little Leo. The sunken ribs, the dark bruises, the undeniable physical evidence of severe prolonged starvation and neglect. I placed the forensic accounting sheets next to the photos. I showed her the highlighted bank transfers, the millions of dollars Connor had embezzled from his own traumatized son to pay for Jessica's luxury vacations and country club fees. I laid out the absolute irrefutable truth under the warm light of our living room lamp. I kept my voice low, steady, and completely grounded. I told Susan that the people leaving those voicemails did not matter. I told her that Reverend Thomas and the country club wives were living in a fragile bubble of absolute fiction. They chose to believe Jessica's lies because acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging that the wealthy, perfect couple they admired were actually sociopathic monsters. It was easier for them to believe that an old mechanic had lost his mind than to admit that evil was living right next door in a white marble mansion. I looked my wife directly in her eyes. I reminded her of the days when we had nothing. I reminded her of the times we ate cheap canned soup for dinner so we could afford to keep the heat on. I reminded her of the honest, grinding sweat that went into building our lives. We did not build our foundation on country club invites or neighborhood gossip. We built it on absolute integrity. We built it on doing the right thing even when the entire world stood against us. I pointed toward the hallway where little Leo was currently sleeping safely in our guest room. He was finally resting in a bed with clean sheets, his stomach full of warm food, far away from the padded walls of that horrible attic. I told Susan that we were not fighting to save our social reputation. We were fighting to save that little boy's life. If saving our grandson meant that every single neighbor turned their back on us, then I considered it a cheap price to pay. If protecting an innocent child meant we could never walk into that church again, then we would pray at home. Susan stared at the medical documents. She looked at the photos of the bruised, starving child. I could see the exact moment the shift happened in her mind. The tears of hurt and betrayal stopped falling. The crushing weight of the social isolation vanished, replaced by a fierce, undeniable maternal fury. She reached out and wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her posture straightened. The soft, gentle woman who baked pies for the church suddenly possessed the unyielding steel of a soldier preparing for a siege. She nodded slowly, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute conviction. She told me I was right. She told me to let them talk, let them spread their lies, and let them leave all the voicemails they wanted. She no longer cared about their judgment. We spent the rest of the day fortifying our legal and emotional bunker. We did not answer a single phone call. I walked over to the landline and unplugged it from the wall jack. Susan powered down her cell phone and placed it in a kitchen drawer. We completely cut off the supply of toxic gossip. We refused to give Trent the satisfaction of knowing his smear campaign was reaching our ears. Instead of worrying about rumors, we focused entirely on our immediate reality. I called Elias Vance on my secured mobile line. I briefed him on the social media attacks and the rumors Trent was spreading through the community. Elias was not surprised. He told me it was a classic desperation tactic used by cornered executives. When the facts are against you, you attack the character of the witness. Elias assured me that neighborhood gossip held absolutely zero weight in a federal court of law. A judge looking at a trail of offshore wire fraud and a signed pediatric trauma report does not care what a country club prayer circle thinks about my mental state. Elias confirmed that his forensic team had officially submitted the embezzlement evidence to the federal authorities. The wheels of absolute justice were already turning, grinding forward with a heavy, unstoppable momentum. The financial freeze on Connor's accounts was holding firm. Trent had tried to file 3 separate emergency motions to unfreeze the corporate assets, and the federal judge had summarily denied every single one of them. My son and his wife were completely out of money, out of options, and running out of time. Elias told me he had confirmed through international flight manifests that Connor and Jessica had booked a private charter flight. They were currently somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean racing back to the United States in an absolute panic. Trent was desperately trying to keep the collapsing real estate company afloat while managing the PR crisis. They were all rushing back to face the fire they had started. I thanked Elias and ended the call. I walked into the guest room to check on Leo. He was sitting up in bed, clutching a small stuffed bear Susan had given him. When I walked in, he did not scramble backward in terror like he had in the attic. He watched me with a quiet, cautious curiosity. I gave him a small, reassuring smile, and for the first time he offered a tiny, almost imperceptible nod in return. That simple gesture cemented my resolve into absolute iron. Trent and Jessica thought they could break us by turning our community against us. They thought the threat of social isolation would make us crumble, but they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the people they were fighting. I was a man who spent 40 years pulling wrecked steel out of the mud. I was not afraid of getting dirty. The smear campaign had failed to break our defensive line. It had only hardened our resolve. We had the evidence, we had the child, and we had the high ground. Our bunker was locked tight. The silence in our home was no longer a heavy burden. It was the calm, steady anticipation of the coming storm. We were absolutely ready for Connor to return. The private charter touched down on American soil just past midnight on a Thursday. Elias had a contact at the Aviation Authority who monitored the tail number the entire way across the Atlantic. I sat in my armchair in the dark, watching the digital tracking blip move across my tablet screen. A normal parent, even a flawed one, would have rushed straight from the tarmac to find their child. If you truly believed your son had been violently abducted by a delusional old man, as they had so publicly claimed, your first instinct would be to tear the city apart looking for him. You would call the police, launch search parties, and break down my front door to get your boy back. But Connor and Jessica did not come to my house. They did not contact the local authorities to report a missing boy. The tracker showed their hired town car bypassing our neighborhood entirely. They drove straight from the private airfield to the lavish downtown country club. Their priority was not a 6-year-old boy who had spent months locked in a padded attic. Their priority was the extravagant, highly publicized charity gala they had scheduled months in advance. The sheer grotesque vanity of it made my stomach turn. Elias had already briefed me on the true purpose of this spectacular event. It was never about raising money for the underprivileged. It was a desperate, calculated theatrical performance. Connor's commercial real estate firm was hemorrhaging cash bleeding out from the toxic loans he had secured. The millions he had illegally siphoned from Leo's blind trust had merely delayed the inevitable collapse. This gala was his final, desperate play. He had invited the wealthiest private equity investors in the state, aiming to dazzle them with ice sculptures, vintage champagne, and a flawless presentation of corporate success. He needed to secure one last massive round of capital investment to save his properties from foreclosure. Jessica, ever the perfect high society wife, was obsessed with maintaining the illusion. She cared more about the floral arrangements and the caterers than the fact that her husband's child was gone. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, blindly trusting that Trent's legal maneuvering had neutralized the threat I posed. They honestly believed the federal freeze on their accounts was just a temporary glitch, a minor bureaucratic hurdle that Trent would effortlessly bat away by Monday morning. Arrogance is a profound blinder. It convinces a man that the world bends to his will right up until the moment the floor gives out beneath his feet. That arrogance arrived at my front porch the very next afternoon in the form of a polished courier. I was sitting on the front steps watching Leo play quietly in the grass with a handful of brightly colored wooden blocks. The boy was still terrified of sudden noises, but the fresh air and the safety of our small yard were working a slow, quiet miracle on his spirit. A sleek black town car rolled to a stop at the curb. A young man in a sharp suit stepped out carrying a thick manila envelope. He walked up my driveway, his eyes scanning my faded denim shirt and scuffed work boots with a look of barely concealed disdain. He asked if I was Harrison Caldwell. I simply nodded, extending my calloused hand. He placed the envelope in my palm, turned on his heel, and drove away without another word. I took the envelope into the kitchen and sat at the wooden table. Susan walked in, drying her hands on a dish towel, her eyes dropping to the thick stack of papers. I broke the seal and slid the documents out. It was a formal non-disclosure agreement, heavily drafted with dense, aggressive legal terminology. Trent had clearly spent the entire flight from Italy typing up this miserable document. I read through the clauses, my vision narrowing with cold disgust. The sheer audacity of the paperwork was staggering. Connor and Trent were offering me a one-time cash payment of $50,000. In exchange, I was required to immediately return the child to their custody. I was legally bound to hand over all original copies of Dr. Eris's medical evaluation, destroy any photographs of the attic, and sign a sworn affidavit stating that my previous claims of abuse were the result of an accidental medication mix-up. If I complied, the contract promised that the psychiatric injunction against Susan and me would be quietly dismissed. As a final insulting concession, Connor offered us supervised visitation rights. We would be allowed to see our grandson for 2 hours on alternating Sundays, provided we never spoke a word of the past. Tucked beneath the legal contract was a handwritten letter from my son. I recognized his sweeping, impatient handwriting immediately. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. He addressed me as Dad, writing about how much he loved me and how much it pained him to see my mind failing. He claimed he understood why I had acted so irrationally, blaming my supposed dementia for the break-in. He urged me to take the money, sign the papers, and let him handle the complex medical needs of his son. He ended the note with a thinly veiled threat, stating that if I forced Trent to execute the injunction, I would spend my final years heavily medicated in a state facility while he took the boy anyway. He thought I was broke. He thought $50,000 was a life-changing sum for a retired diesel mechanic. He thought the threat of a costly legal battle would break my spine and force me to submit. He had no idea that I could buy his entire failing real estate portfolio with the spare capital in my investment accounts. I did not tear the papers up. I did not throw them in the trash. I carefully placed the non-disclosure agreement and the handwritten letter back into the manila envelope. This was not just a desperate negotiation tactic. It was tangible proof of coercion and attempted witness tampering. Trent had just handed me the rope to hang his own career. I left Susan to watch over Leo and drove straight downtown to Elias Vance's law firm. I bypassed the receptionist and walked directly into the secure glass conference room where the real war was being mapped out. Elias was waiting for me, but he was not alone. Sitting around the heavy mahogany table were three individuals who did not look like standard corporate litigators. They wore sharp, nondescript gray suits and carried an air of absolute humorless authority. Elias introduced them. Two of the men were senior investigators for the Securities and Exchange Commission. The woman sitting next to them was a high-ranking director from the Regional Office of Child Protective Services. I placed the manila envelope on the center of the table. I told Elias that my son had just attempted to purchase my silence. Elias slid the documents out, reading through Trent's drafted agreement. A sharp, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. He handed the papers to the federal investigators. They reviewed the contract and the handwritten letter, their expressions remaining entirely stoic. Elias looked at me and explained the monumental shift in our battlefield. The forensic accountants had delivered their preliminary audit to the federal authorities the night before. The sheer volume of the wire fraud was devastating. Connor had not just stolen from a child. He had taken those stolen trust funds and used them to artificially inflate the value of his commercial properties, deliberately defrauding dozens of high-profile private equity investors. The SEC was no longer just casually interested. They were preparing a massive federal indictment. The CPS director spoke next. Her voice was gentle, but laced with iron. She had reviewed Dr. Aris's medical affidavit and the photographic evidence of the padded attic. She informed me that Connor and Jessica were entirely unfit to ever hold parental rights again. The state was prepared to move forward with emergency permanent custody orders, placing Leo officially and legally under my protection. She assured me that the boy would never spend another second in that sterile house of horrors. But there was a tactical problem we needed to solve. Connor was a significant flight risk. The moment he realized the federal freeze on his accounts was not a bureaucratic error, but a targeted criminal investigation, he would likely attempt to flee the country. He still had access to wealthy friends, private planes, and offshore connections that Trent had undoubtedly hidden from the primary audit. We could not simply knock on his front door with a standard warrant. If Trent caught wind of the approaching authorities, he would tie the local police up in jurisdictional red tape for days while he orchestrated an escape. We needed a synchronized, undeniable strike. We needed to cut off every single avenue of escape simultaneously. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He looked at the federal agents, then at me. He laid out a plan that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. We were not going to serve the warrants quietly in the morning. We were not going to give Trent the home field advantage of his private estate. We were going to execute the takedown in the most public, heavily secured environment possible. We were going to strike at the charity gala. The logic was flawless. Connor and Jessica would be completely surrounded by the exact investors they were attempting to defraud. Trent would be present, trapped in a room full of powerful people, completely unable to use his private security contractors to block federal marshals. The sheer public spectacle of the event would guarantee that no backdoor deals could be brokered. It would be a total instantaneous collapse of their carefully constructed illusion. The SEC investigators agreed to the timeline. They needed 48 hours to secure the final federal signatures for the asset seizures and the arrest warrants for wire fraud. The CPS director confirmed she would have the emergency custody transfer finalized by a federal family court judge before the weekend. Everything was aligning with devastating precision. Elias looked at me and asked if I was prepared for the fallout. He warned me that a public takedown of this magnitude would be incredibly messy. It would strip my son of his dignity in front of hundreds of people. It would be in the local papers. It would permanently destroy any lingering shred of a relationship I might ever hope to have with the boy I raised. I looked around the room at the federal agents, the lawyers, and the mountain of evidence stacked on the table. I thought about the foul odor of that locked attic. I thought about the 6-year-old boy shivering in the corner clutching a tablet because the trauma had stolen his ability to speak. I thought about the sheer, unforgivable arrogance of a son who believed he could lock a child in the dark and buy off his own father for $50,000. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation. The man hosting that gala was not my son. He was a parasite wearing my son's face. I told Elias that I was absolutely ready. I told him I wanted every single camera flashing and every single investor watching when the empire fell. The trap was officially set. The legal machinery was fully locked and loaded. I left the downtown law firm and drove back to my quiet neighborhood. I spent the evening sitting on the porch with Susan watching the fireflies dance in the warm evening air. I held her hand and told her the plan. She did not flinch. She simply nodded her grip, tightening around my fingers. We had spent our lives building a legacy of honesty and hard work. Now we were going to use that foundation to break the cycle of cruelty our son had created. The gala was only 2 days away, and the storm was finally ready to break. The downtown country club was an imposing fortress of polished limestone and sheer glass, sitting heavily right in the heart of the city's elite financial district. I parked my reliable old pickup truck 3 blocks away, purposely avoiding the long, glittering line of luxury sedans and imported sports cars queuing up for the valet station. The humid night air wrapped around my shoulders as I stepped onto the pavement. I was not wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo. I wore my best Sunday suit, a simple charcoal wool 2-piece that my wife Susan had bought for me over a decade ago. It was clean, meticulously pressed, and smelled faintly of cedar, but it was miles away from the silk and velvet waiting inside those towering doors. In my right hand, I tightly gripped a thick, weathered leather briefcase. It contained the absolute ruin of my son. I walked down the illuminated sidewalk, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of my heavy leather boots against the concrete. 40 years of dragging mangled steel off the interstate of bleeding brake lines and rebuilding shattered diesel engines had built a quiet, unyielding strength deep into my bones. I never wanted this world of fake smiles, expensive champagne, and empty promises. I had spent my entire life trying to protect my family from the very corruption that currently funded the extravagant party taking place inside that building. As I approached the grand marble steps leading up to the main entrance, I saw them. Trent had spared no expense trying to secure his perimeter. 3 massive men wearing dark tailored suits and tactical earpieces stood blocking the heavy mahogany doors. They were private security contractors, the kind of expensive, ruthless muscle hired to keep unwanted elements away from high society events. Trent had undoubtedly given them my description, warning them that a delusional, dangerous old man might attempt to crash the gala. The largest of the 3 men stepped forward as my boot hit the first marble step. He held up a thick, broad hand, his face set in a mask of professional intimidation. He told me the event was strictly private, and that I needed to turn around and walk away before they forcibly removed me from the property. I did not break my stride. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not turn around. Before the security contractor could close the distance between us, a synchronized, flawless operation unfolded right before my eyes. Elias Vance stepped out from behind a massive stone pillar near the valet podium. He was not alone. 4 men and 2 women wearing dark, unassuming windbreakers materialized from the shadows of the courtyard, moving with a terrifying, absolute precision. They were United States federal marshals coordinated entirely by Elias and the federal prosecutor handling the wire fraud indictments. The lead marshal did not shout or draw a weapon. He simply walked straight up to Trent's lead security contractor, flipped open a leather wallet to display a shining silver badge, and spoke in a tone that brokered zero argument. He informed the private guards that this was now an active federal crime scene. He quietly ordered them to step aside, turn off their earpieces, and keep their hands entirely visible, or they would be immediately arrested for obstruction of a federal investigation. Trent's expensive corporate thugs folded instantly. They were paid to intimidate civilians, not to engage in a standoff with federal law enforcement. They stepped back, pressing themselves against the stone pillars, their arrogant expressions melting into pale, nervous compliance. Elias offered me a sharp, grim nod. The perimeter was ours. I walked past the neutralized guards and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors, stepping into the sprawling, opulent lobby of the country club. The federal marshals fanned out silently behind me, securing the exits, neutralizing the remaining private security personnel, and locking down the building without making a single sound that would alert the guests inside the ballroom. It was a cinematic, perfectly orchestrated siege, executed with the cold efficiency of absolute justice. I approached the massive velvet-draped doors leading into the grand ballroom. They were slightly ajar, allowing the bright light and the amplified sound of the event to spill out into the quiet lobby. I slipped through the narrow opening, letting the dark shadows at the very back of the room swallow me whole. The sheer grotesque scale of the event hit me like a physical blow. The ballroom was a sickening display of corporate excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of circular tables covered in white silk linens. Mountains of imported exotic floral arrangements served as centerpieces. Hundreds of the city's most powerful private equity investors, real estate developers, and local politicians sat sipping vintage champagne, completely oblivious to the horrific reality funding their evening. And there, standing behind a clear acrylic podium, bathed in a bright, expensive spotlight at the front of the room, was my son. Connor wore a tuxedo that likely cost more than a working family's yearly grocery budget. His hair was perfectly styled, his smile radiant and practiced. He looked like the absolute pinnacle of suburban success. He was holding a crystal glass in one hand, gesturing broadly with the other as he delivered his keynote speech. The acoustics of the room carried his smooth, polished voice perfectly to where I stood in the shadows. He was speaking about building a legacy for the next generation. He spun a beautiful, sickeningly sweet narrative about the importance of family values, community outreach, and corporate responsibility. He told the crowd of wealthy investors that his commercial real estate firm was not just about turning a profit. He claimed it was about creating safe, prosperous environments for families to thrive. He actually had the sheer monstrous audacity to mention his newly formed charitable foundation, claiming a portion of the night's proceeds would go directly toward helping vulnerable, underprivileged children find secure homes. The absolute hypocrisy of his words made my stomach churn with a violent, righteous disgust. This was the man who had locked his own 6-year-old flesh and blood in a dark, padded attic. This was the man who had allowed his traumatized son to starve next to a plastic bucket while he drained the boy's massive trust fund to pay for the very champagne currently flowing into the glasses of his guests. He was standing on a stage begging for millions of dollars in investments, wearing the mask of a devoted philanthropist. The crowd erupted into a polite, enthusiastic round of applause. Connor smiled modestly, bowing his head to soak in the adoration of his peers. The applause faded, replaced by the soft, elegant hum of a jazz quartet playing in the corner and the gentle clinking of expensive silverware. The moment was perfect. The trap was fully primed. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase so tightly that the old stiff material creaked in my hand. I stepped out of the velvet-draped shadows and placed my heavy leather work boot onto the pristine white runner rug that stretched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not rush. I did not run. Every step I took was slow, measured, and carried the heavy, undeniable weight of an impending reckoning. My boots hit the polished hardwood floor beneath the rug with a rhythmic, heavy thud that slowly began to cut through the soft jazz music. The investors sitting at the back tables noticed me first. I saw their confused, judging glances. I was an old man with calloused hands, a weathered face, and a modest suit walking directly through the center of their elite, exclusive sanctuary. The murmurs began to ripple through the room like a wave. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The jazz quartet noticed the shifting atmosphere, and the music slowly faltered, dying out into a tense, heavy silence. I kept walking, my eyes locked entirely on the man standing at the podium. Halfway down the aisle, Jessica finally saw me. She was sitting at the primary VIP table, right in front of the stage, draped in a shimmering emerald silk gown, surrounded by the wives of prominent bankers. I watched the exact second her curated, arrogant facade shattered into a million unfixable pieces. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain ghost. Her jaw dropped, and her hand trembled so violently that her champagne flute tipped over, spilling expensive wine across the pristine white tablecloth. Trent was sitting right beside her. He shot up from his chair the moment he followed his sister's horrified gaze. His eyes widened in absolute panic. I saw him immediately reach for the small microphone clipped to his lapel, desperately trying to summon his private security detail to intercept me. He spoke frantically into his collar, completely unaware that his highly paid thugs were currently standing with their hands against the lobby walls, detained by federal agents. Trent looked toward the main doors, expecting to see his men rushing in. Instead, he saw the grim, stoic faces of the United States Marshals stepping into the light, blocking every single exit in the ballroom. Trent sank back into his chair, utterly defeated. He knew it was over. I reached the front of the room. Connor had frozen completely at the podium. The smooth, charismatic smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He gripped the edges of the clear acrylic stand so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked down at me, his chest heaving under his expensive tuxedo jacket. He tried to maintain the illusion for the hundreds of investors watching our silent exchange. He leaned slightly over the microphone, covering the receiver with his hand, and hissed a desperate, pleading whisper down at me. He begged me to stop. He promised to give me whatever I wanted. He pleaded with me not to ruin the gala, promising that we could settle the entire situation quietly in the back room if I just turned around and walked away. I stopped at the base of the short set of stairs leading up to the stage. I looked up at the son I had spent my life sacrificing for the boy I had loved with every ounce of my soul, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, necessary resolve. I did not shout. I did not cause a hysterical, undignified scene. I did not need to raise my voice to command the room. I spoke in a deep, resonant tone that carried the absolute, unshakable weight of truth. My voice projected clearly into the dead silence of the massive ballroom, ensuring that every single investor partner and socialite sitting at those tables heard exactly what I had to say. I told him I was not here to negotiate a quiet surrender. I placed my heavy leather briefcase squarely onto the edge of the stage right at his feet. I snapped the brass latches open. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunfire in the quiet room. I reached inside the briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of official, heavily stamped legal documents Elias and the federal authorities had prepared. I handed him the papers. My hand did not shake. My gaze did not waver. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes and told him exactly what he was holding. I told him he was holding federal subpoenas for grand embezzlement wire fraud and the theft of an 8-figure trust fund. I told him he was holding the official asset freeze notifications that had already locked down every single bank account credit line and property deed attached to his name. Connor's hands trembled violently as he took the documents. He stared down at the heavy blue seals of the federal court, his breathing reducing to shallow, panicked gasps. Then I pulled out the final document. It was the most important piece of paper in the entire briefcase. I held it out to him, making sure the bold black text was clearly visible. I told him it was an emergency permanent custody order signed by a federal family court judge. I informed him in front of the entire silent room that the starved, abused 6-year-old boy he had locked in a padded attic was now legally, permanently, and entirely mine. Connor stood frozen, clutching the ruin of his entire empire in his shaking hands. The polished, arrogant real estate mogul was dead. All that remained was a terrified criminal, realizing he had nowhere left to run. I stepped back from the stage, leaving him to face the devastating, inescapable reality of the trap I had sprung. The silence in the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. It was not a peaceful quiet, but the terrifying stillness that precedes a massive structural collapse. I stood at the base of the stage, watching my son stare down at the stack of federal subpoenas resting in his trembling hands. The thick, heavy paper bore the undeniable seals of the United States government. The crystal chandeliers above us cast a bright, unforgiving light on his pale, sweating face. For decades, Connor had lived a life shielded by the illusion of immense wealth and untouchable privilege. He had surrounded himself with sycophants and expensive lawyers who convinced him he was invincible. Right up until this very second, he truly believed he could buy his way out of any consequence. But the documents he was holding could not be shredded or ignored. They were the physical manifestation of his utter ruin. I turned my gaze toward the hundreds of guests seated at the lavish tables behind me. These were the elite power brokers of our city. They were commercial real estate moguls, private equity directors, and wealthy socialites who had gathered here tonight to be dazzled by my son. They had come to write massive checks to secure their piece of his fraudulent empire. Now they were shifting uncomfortably in their silk-upholstered chairs. They could sense the sudden violent change in the atmosphere. The gentle clinking of silver forks against fine china had stopped entirely. The jazz quartet in the corner had lowered their instruments, completely unsure of how to proceed. The polished, expensive mask of the charity gala was slipping away, revealing the ugly, desperate reality underneath. From the shadows near the grand entrance, Elias Vance stepped forward into the light. He was followed immediately by the lead investigator from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal agent did not look like a man impressed by the luxury surrounding him. He wore a simple gray suit and carried a briefcase that matched my own. He walked down the center aisle with a slow, methodical stride that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He bypassed the terrified guests and stepped directly up to the acrylic podium where Connor was still frozen in shock. The agent reached out and gently but firmly took the microphone from the stand. He did not shout. He spoke in a measured, bureaucratic tone that carried the cold, heavy weight of federal authority. He introduced himself to the silent crowd and announced that the event was officially terminated. He informed the room of high society investors that the commercial real estate firm they were preparing to fund was currently the subject of a massive federal criminal investigation. He stated clearly that every single asset, bank account, and property deed attached to Connor and his dummy corporations had been frozen by a federal judge due to severe allegations of trust fund embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and chaotic. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous ballroom. The wealthy investors who had just been applauding my son a few moments ago suddenly realized their own financial interests were in direct peril. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor as powerful men stood up, pulling out their cell phones to call their legal teams. The very people Connor had relied on to save him were now scrambling to distance themselves from his toxic, sinking ship. They looked at him not with respect or admiration, but with pure, unadulterated disgust. He was no longer a visionary developer to them. He was a liability, down at the primary VIP table. Right in front of the stage, the reality of the situation finally crashed into Jessica. She had spent the entire evening playing the role of the perfect, radiant hostess. She had smiled for the cameras, poured vintage champagne, and projected an image of flawless suburban royalty. But as the federal agent spoke, the exact details of the asset freeze her curated facade completely evaporated. She realized in real time that her offshore accounts, her platinum credit cards, and her endless supply of stolen luxury were gone forever. A loud, sharp crash echoed near the stage. Jessica had dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the polished floor, sending a spray of expensive wine across the hem of her shimmering emerald gown. She did not even look down at the mess. She shot up from her chair, her face contorted into an ugly, desperate mask of panic. The loyal, devoted wife routine vanished the exact second her financial security was threatened. She looked up at Connor, who was still standing paralyzed on the stage, and she unleashed a vicious, hysterical scream. She pointed a trembling finger at my son and practically shrieked that she had nothing to do with the financial crimes. She yelled to the federal agents and the staring crowd that she was entirely innocent. She claimed she was just a wife who had been kept completely in the dark about the dummy corporations and the offshore routing numbers. She desperately tried to throw Connor straight under the bus, screaming that the embezzlement was entirely his idea and that he had manipulated her into signing documents she did not understand. She even tried to deny her involvement in locking little Leo in the attic, sobbing that Connor had forced her to hire the shadow nanny against her will. It was a pathetic, sickening display of absolute cowardice. She was perfectly happy to spend millions of dollars stolen from a traumatized 6-year-old boy to fund her lavish vacations in Tuscany. But the moment the federal authorities arrived, she was perfectly willing to feed her own husband to the wolves to save her own skin. Connor snapped out of his paralyzed shock as his wife's screams washed over him. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. His face turned a dark, mottled red. He leaned over the edge of the stage and screamed right back at Jessica, calling her a greedy, parasitic liar. He yelled that she was the one who demanded the expensive clothes, the luxury cars, and the country club memberships that had driven him into massive debt in the first place. He reminded her loudly in front of all their peers that she was the one who refused to let Leo live in the main house because the boy ruined her aesthetic. The vicious public fracturing of their alliance was a spectacular, ugly sight. The two of them were tearing each other to pieces like cornered rats, abandoning any shred of loyalty or human decency. But the implosion was not over yet. From the corner of my eye, I caught a sudden frantic movement. Trent, the slick corporate lawyer who had orchestrated the entire legal smokescreen, was attempting to quietly slip away. He had abandoned his seat at the VIP table and was inching backward toward the heavy velvet curtains covering a side exit. He knew the forensic accountants had likely uncovered his direct involvement in creating the dummy corporations. He was trying to escape before the handcuffs came out. He did not make it far. 2 United States Marshals stepped out from behind the velvet drapes, completely blocking his path. They did not say a word. They simply crossed their arms and stared him down. Trent bumped into them, let out a startled gasp, and stumbled backward right back into the open light of the ballroom. Connor saw his brother-in-law attempting to flee and completely lost whatever fragile grip on his sanity he had left. He pointed violently at Trent and began screaming to the federal agents. He yelled that Trent was the mastermind. He claimed that the lawyer had drafted every single fraudulent invoice, had set up the offshore banking accounts, and had legally insulated the entire operation. Connor shrieked that he was just following legal advice and that Trent was the true criminal who had orchestrated the theft of the trust fund. Trent straightened his tailored jacket, his face pale with sweat, and fired back with equal venom. He yelled across the room that Connor was a weak, pathetic failure of a businessman who could not keep his own company afloat without stealing from an orphaned child. Trent claimed he was simply providing standard corporate counsel, and that Connor had acted entirely on his own rogue authority. The 3 villains were completely consumed by panic, turning on each other with a feral, terrifying desperation. The loyalty built on stolen money crumbled the very second the money ran out. The lead federal agent had seen enough. He signaled to the marshals stationed around the room. The officers moved in with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. They did not care about the screaming matches or the desperate accusations. They approached Trent first, spinning him around and snapping heavy steel handcuffs shut around his wrists. The slick, untouchable attorney was read his rights in front of the entire horrified country club. 2 more agents moved toward the VIP table. Jessica tried to back away, sobbing hysterically and begging them not to touch her. She pleaded that her dress was too expensive, that she could not go to jail, that she was a victim of her husband's lies. The agents ignored her cries entirely, restraining her hands behind her back and walking her firmly toward the lobby doors. The elite high society peers she had spent her life trying to impress watched her get hauled away in absolute, stunned silence. Finally, the lead agent turned toward the stage. Connor watched the marshals approaching the steps. The reality of his absolute destruction finally broke through his final layer of arrogance. His real estate empire was gone. His stolen wealth was gone. His wife and lawyer had turned on him and were currently being marched out in handcuffs. He had absolutely nothing and no one left. He looked out across the room and his eyes locked onto mine. The arrogant, venomous monster who had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward just 24 hours ago completely vanished. In his place was a terrified, desperate boy. He fell to his knees right there on the wooden stage, ignoring the federal agents climbing the steps behind him. He scrambled toward the edge of the platform directly above where I was standing. Tears streamed down his face, ruining his pristine appearance. He reached his shaking hands out toward me, pleading with a pathetic, broken voice. He begged me to help him. He begged me to call off the lawyers, to pay his bail, to use my wealth to hire a defense team. He sobbed, claiming he was still my son, that he had just made a terrible mistake, and that he desperately needed his father to save him one last time. He promised he would change. He promised he would go to therapy. He promised he would do whatever I demanded if I just bailed him out of this nightmare. I stood there looking up at the weeping, pathetic mess of a man kneeling before me. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I did not feel the protective instinct of a father. My heart was completely cold and steady. I thought about little Leo sleeping safely in my guest room, terrified of loud noises and starved for basic human affection. I thought about the decades of honest, grueling labor I had endured to provide a good life for my family. I had spent 40 years building a foundation of integrity, and my son had chosen to build his life on cruelty and deception. I looked my son dead in the eye, making sure my voice carried clearly over his pathetic sobbing. I spoke with a quiet, devastating finality that shattered whatever tiny sliver of hope he had left. I told him I spent my life building things that last. You built a life on stolen money and a tortured child. I have no son. Connor let out a harrowing, agonizing wail, covering his face with his hands, as the federal marshals pulled him up from the stage by his shoulders. They locked the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists and turned him toward the exit. I did not stay to watch them read him his rights. I turned my back on the stage, on the silent, stunned crowd of investors, and on the shattered remains of a criminal empire. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase and walked straight down the center aisle, out of the grand ballroom and out the heavy mahogany doors. The cool night air hit my face as I walked down the marble steps toward my reliable old truck. The war was officially over. Justice had been served completely and absolutely. I was going home to my wife and to the little boy who finally had a real family. Sometimes the hardest thing a man has to do is look at his own flesh and blood and accept that the person he raised has chosen to become a monster. You cannot fix a foundation built on greed and cruelty. You can only tear it down and start over, protecting the innocent lives left in the wreckage. True family is not determined by biology. It is determined by love, integrity, and the willingness to do the right thing, even when it breaks your heart. If my story resonated with you tonight, please leave a like to bring some peace to this old man's soul. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next life stories I will share with all my heart. And tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me truly happy to know which corner of the world is keeping me company today. Take care of yourselves and never stop fighting for the truth. The crisp morning air carried a different kind of quiet the day after the charity gala. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of secrets being kept in the dark. It was the clear, breathable stillness that follows a violent storm. The massive federal machine Elias Vance had unleashed did not slow down to let anyone catch their breath. It moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency that absolutely crushed everything in its path. For years, my son and his arrogant lawyer brother-in-law had used the legal system as a weapon against the weak. They had manipulated trust funds, forged invoices, and paid off the right people to build a fortress of absolute privilege. They truly believed that wearing expensive suits and throwing lavish events made them untouchable. They learned the hard way that when the federal government decides to dismantle a fraudulent empire, they do it all the way down to the bedrock. The indictments came down fast and heavy. Connor and Trent were formally charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and severe child endangerment. There were no quiet plea deals in elegant back rooms. The evidence we provided today was far too devastating. The public nature of the arrests had successfully drawn the hungry eyes of the national media outlets. The highly skilled forensic accountants Elias originally hired mapped out every single stolen dollar very quickly. They traced the massive sums of money directly from Little Leo Trust into the rapidly failing commercial real estate accounts. Trent tried desperately to use his polished corporate legal tricks to delay the necessary process, but the prosecutors had him entirely boxed in. The judge ordered them both held completely, without bail, citing their access to offshore accounts and extreme flight risk. The two men who had once arrogantly commanded rooms full of millionaire private equity investors were now sitting in sterile concrete holding cells. They wore cheap orange jumpsuits instead of custom-tailored tuxedos. The sheer, beautiful irony of their tremendous downfall brought a deep, resolute satisfaction to my weary soul. They were utterly ruined by the exact same legal and financial systems they had spent their entire adult careers manipulating. Connor watched his commercial real estate firm completely collapse in a matter of mere days. The massive loans he had foolishly taken out defaulted immediately upon his formal arrest, causing endless chaos everywhere for him. The extremely wealthy private equity investors who had been drinking his vintage champagne at the charity gala scrambled frantically to seize whatever physical properties they could quickly get their hands on. His empty luxury condos and completely failing suburban strip malls were ruthlessly liquidated at public auction for absolute pennies on the dollar. Every single material thing he had wrongly valued over the life of his own flesh and blood evaporated into thin air almost overnight. He had intentionally traded his mortal soul for a grand illusion of endless wealth, and the fragile illusion had finally shattered, leaving him with absolutely nothing. Jessica faced a terrible reckoning of her own, and her rapid descent was perhaps the most pathetic thing to witness. The woman who had spent years carefully curating a flawless high society image suddenly found herself completely destitute and disgraced. The strict federal asset freeze formally stripped her of her imported Italian sports cars, her expensive designer wardrobes, and her exclusive local country club memberships. She frantically tried to play the innocent victim, attempting to magically convince the authorities that she was just a clueless wife kept entirely in the dark by her criminal husband all year long. But the meticulous forensic paper trail told a completely different and damning story. The investigators quickly found her personal signature on dozens of legal documents deliberately funneling stolen trust money directly into multiple dummy corporations to fund her lavish lifestyle. She was formally and brutally indicted on multiple felony accessory charges. The vicious social smear campaign she had aggressively launched against Susan and me backfired with spectacular surgical precision. The elite suburban neighbors and local church members who had eagerly listened to her fabricated lies about my mental state turned their backs on her the exact moment the federal criminal charges became public knowledge. The people she truly thought were her loyal friends abandoned her instantly, desperate to completely avoid being associated with such a toxic media scandal. She was legally forced to file for personal bankruptcy and face the devastating, terrifying reality of the criminal justice system completely isolated and alone. She had cowardly weaponized her social status to severely isolate us, and now she was drowning in the exact same absolute isolation she had specifically designed for my family. Systemic karma rarely ever misses its primary target in this harsh, unyielding world of ours today for us all. While the absolute ruins of their once massive empire actively smoldered into ash, we focused entirely on the future. The total physical and emotional recovery of our beautiful grandson was the only thing that truly mattered anymore. Susan and I walked into the grand federal family court building a few short weeks later, not as frightened grandparents fighting a massive corrupt corporate machine, but as the totally undisputed protectors of a deeply wounded young child. The presiding judge was a remarkably stern, meticulous older woman who had thoroughly reviewed Dr. Aris' extensive medical affidavits and the highly detailed reports from Child Protective Services. She did not waste any time with unnecessary, annoying bureaucratic delays or legal grandstanding. She looked at us with a profound, genuine respect and officially granted Susan and me full, permanent legal custody of young Leo. The heavy wooden gavel struck the solid-sounding block, permanently sealing the court order, and I felt a massive, heavy weight finally lift from my tired, weary shoulders. Elias Vance stood right beside us throughout the entire grueling process, proving his tremendous worth 1,000 times over in that room. He was a completely ruthless litigator inside the boardroom, always indeed. However, he had a surprisingly gentle, compassionate heart when it specifically came to fiercely protecting the innocent. He personally oversaw the complete, careful restoration of Little Leo Massive Blind Trust Fund. The relentless federal government effectively seized whatever remaining legitimate financial assets Connor and Trent still possessed and forcefully redirected those exact funds straight back into the boy accounts to completely replace the stolen millions. Elias legally restructured the entire financial trust, placing it firmly under the absolute unyielding protection of his own private law firm. He officially established totally impenetrable corporate oversight protocols, ensuring that the massive sum of money was completely and totally inaccessible to anyone on Earth except Leo, when he finally came of proper legal age. The incredible fortune that was originally meant to guarantee the growing boy a lifetime of absolute security, top medical care, and elite education was permanently totally secured once and for all. Bringing Leo permanently into our quiet, highly modest home was a remarkably slow and incredibly delicate ongoing process of emotional healing. The deep, terrible trauma he had unfairly endured in that dark, horrible, dead-bolted attic space had obviously left deep, lingering, painful scar on his young, fragile mind today. For the first few long, quiet weeks, he barely made a single audible sound, holding his small, thin body rigidly tense whenever I slowly walked into the room. He was absolutely terrified of sudden fast movements and unpredictable loud noises, but Susan undeniably possessed an infinite bottomless well of genuine patience and warm maternal grace. She did not ever aggressively force him to talk or play. She simply provided a deeply steady, unwavering presence of absolute, undeniable safety. She cooked warm, delicious, nourishing meals. She sat quietly reading beside him, while he gently colored on the soft living room floor, and she softly, beautifully sang him to sleep every single night without fail. I consciously focused entirely on showing the growing boy exactly what a real, honest, protective father figure looked like. I did not wear expensive tailored suits or carry fancy leather briefcases. I wore faded blue denim and heavily calloused work boots. I brought him out to the small, dusty garage behind our quiet house and let him sit peacefully on a small wooden stool while I meticulously restored dirty old engines. I showed him how complex, heavily broken things could be, carefully taken completely apart nicely today. I explained how true patience and hard, honest work could effectively fix almost anything in this world. Slowly, the highly terrified, defensive outer shell began to significantly crack. He started to consistently follow me around the grassy yard, happily carrying small, shiny wrenches and eagerly handing them to me whenever I kindly asked. The deep, haunted, totally empty look in his big brown eyes began to permanently fade, rapidly replaced by a quiet, cautious, wonderful curiosity about the vast, beautiful world all around him. The magical breakthrough finally happened on a beautifully warm, exceptionally sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was peacefully sitting on the wooden front porch, happily sipping cold iced tea, while young Leo joyfully played in the soft green grass near the giant old oak tree. He had wonderfully found a small, brightly colored, fuzzy caterpillar and was intensely watching it slowly crawl across a wide, bright green leaf. He quickly turned his little head, looked directly at me, and offered a completely genuine, full, radiant, happy smile. He then pointed happily at the green leaf and spoke his very first real word since we had successfully rescued him from the dark. He simply excitedly said "bug nicely" today. I felt warm, joyful tears intensely prick the very corners of my old, tired eyes. I smiled broadly back at my precious grandson, my heavy heart happily swelling with an utterly overwhelming, profound sense of endless peace. The terrible, horrible monster who had cruelly stolen his innocent voice was permanently locked in a secure federal prison cell, and the beautiful, highly innocent young boy was finally beginning to safely speak again. We absolutely did not ever need a massive white marble mansion or a large, expensive fleet of imported luxury cars to be fully, completely happy. We certainly did not need to falsely impress wealthy country club socialites or desperately rub elbows with elite corporate private equity investors. We had a wonderfully quiet, comfortable home, constantly filled with incredibly genuine, pure love, absolute mutual respect, and the utterly solid certainty that we had successfully done the exact right thing. The immense, difficult legal battle had been agonizingly exhausting, and the vicious, horrible betrayal from my very own biological son would sadly always leave a dull, painful ache in my old chest forever. But happily looking at young Leo freely laughing in the bright, warm, beautiful morning sunlight today right now, I knew deep down I would undoubtedly gladly fight that exact same vicious war 100 more times over just to permanently keep him completely safe. There is a profoundly unyielding, brutal truth about this entire world that wealthy, incredibly arrogant people often simply forget. You can easily forge legal documents, carefully hire highly expensive private security guards, and continuously build massive, towering fortresses entirely out of stolen, dirty money. You can successfully initially manipulate the entire complicated legal system and relentlessly spread vicious, horrible lies to aggressively protect your entirely fraudulent public reputation. But absolutely all of that is truly nothing more than a highly fragile, delicate house of paper cards, just waiting for the harsh wind to powerfully blow. True personal integrity is honestly the absolute only solid bedrock foundation that ever truly lasts forever. When you tragically base your entire human existence on pure, selfish greed and the horrible suffering of totally innocent, defenseless people, the vast universe eventually always angrily comes to forcefully collect the unpaid debt. Thank you so much for watching my story today. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and comment your exact current location and time down below right now. 6 months is a strange measure of time. In the grand scheme of a long life, it is barely a breath. But when you are watching a shattered soul slowly knit itself back together, piece by fragile piece, 6 months can feel like a complete rebirth. The bitter frost of that terrible winter had finally surrendered to a bright, forgiving spring. Our modest single-story home on the quiet side of town had transformed entirely. It was no longer just a quiet retirement sanctuary for an old mechanic and his wife. It had become a vibrant, living fortress of healing. The sterile, suffocating silence that once defined my grandson's existence had been replaced by the gentle, comforting symphony of a real childhood. The scent of Susan baking cinnamon apples and fresh bread seemed to permanently settle into the very wood of the walls. There were brightly colored toy trucks scattered across the living room rug, and the television frequently hummed with the cheerful sounds of morning cartoons. I remember those early days right after the federal authorities took Connor away. Bringing Leo into our home was like trying to care for a frightened, wounded bird that had never known the warmth of the sun. He would flinch at the sound of the front door closing. He would hide his food in his pockets, terrified that someone might suddenly take it away from him. His little body was so frail, so completely devoid of nourishment, that my heart physically ached every time I looked at his sunken cheeks. But we did not rush him. We did not demand that he magically recover overnight. We hired the absolute best pediatric trauma therapists in the state, using the newly secured funds from his restored trust. A wonderful patient woman named Dr. Evans came to the house 3 times a week. She did not wear a clinical white coat or carry intimidating medical charts. She sat on the floor with him, using art and quiet play to gently unlock the heavy iron doors his mind had built to survive the attic. She brought him large sheets of thick paper and boxes of bright crayons, encouraging him to express the heavy, complicated feelings he could not yet vocalize. For the first few weeks, he only drew with the darkest black and gray colors, pressing so hard the wax would snap in his small hands. But gradually, slowly, beautifully bright, vibrant greens and warm yellows began to appear on the pages. Slowly, the terrifying physical evidence of his extreme neglect began to completely fade away. Susan cooked rich, hearty meals filled with proper nutrients. She made savory chicken stews, thick mashed potatoes, and sweet buttered peas. We watched with profound, immense gratitude as the pale gray tint of his skin was replaced by a healthy, warm glow. He began to put on weight, his small arms and legs finally filling out with the natural strength of a growing boy. The dark, heavy circles under his brown eyes melted away, revealing a bright, curious spark that had been buried under months of absolute terror. He stopped hiding his food. He started sitting at the kitchen table with us, eating until he was completely full and satisfied. The rigid, defensive posture he used to hold whenever someone entered the room gradually relaxed. He learned that nobody in this house would ever raise a hand to him. He learned that a dropped glass of water would only be met with a dry towel and a gentle reassurance, not a screaming fit of violent rage. He realized that a locked door did not mean punishment, but simply a safe, quiet place to sleep. The most beautiful transformation, however, was not entirely physical. It happened on a remarkably quiet, golden Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting out on our back porch holding a piece of fine sandpaper. I was carefully restoring an old wooden toy train I had found at a local antique market. The warm spring breeze was carrying the sweet scent of blooming jasmine across the yard. Leo was sitting on the top step a few feet away from me. He was quietly watching my hands work the wood. He had spent the last few weeks shadowing me like a tiny, silent apprentice. He loved watching me fix broken things in the dusty garage. I suppose it gave him a profound sense of order in a world that had previously been entirely chaotic and cruel. I finished sanding the small wooden wheels and blew the fine dust off the smooth surface. I held the restored toy out toward him. He hesitated for a brief second before reaching out with his small, delicate fingers to take it. He turned the little train over in his hands, examining the moving wheels with wide, fascinated eyes. Then he did something that made time stop entirely. He looked up from the wooden toy and locked his big brown eyes directly onto mine. He did not look away quickly. He did not shrink back into his protective, defensive shell. He took a slow, deep breath, filling his small chest with the warm afternoon air. And then a soft, clear voice broke the peaceful silence of the porch. "Thank you, Grandpa." 3 simple words. 3 small, fragile words, spoken with the absolute utmost sincerity. but to an old man who had spent months fighting a massive, corrupt corporate machine to save this exact child, those 3 words sounded like a triumphant roar of absolute victory. They were the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my 70-plus years on this earth. My vision blurred heavily with thick, hot tears. I did not try to hide them or wipe them away. I smiled a broad, genuine smile that stretched across my weathered face, and I reached out to gently ruffle his dark hair. I told him he was very welcome, and that he would never have to be afraid of the dark ever again. In that single defining moment, every grueling hour of the bitter legal war, every painful, devastating betrayal by my own flesh and blood, and every single moment of profound emotional exhaustion vanished completely from my weary bones. The evenings in our house have taken on a completely different rhythm now. After the sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and bruised orange, the house settles into a comfortable, quiet routine. Susan usually sits in her worn, floral armchair with a thick, woven blanket draped across her lap, quietly knitting or reading a thick novel. Leo sits nearby on the plush rug, completely absorbed in a colorful picture book, or carefully arranging his massive collection of toy cars. I usually sit in my own sturdy recliner, simply watching them. I watch the gentle rise and fall of my grandson's chest as he breathes easily, without fear. I watch the soft, contented smile playing on my wife's lips. The immense, profound contrast between this simple, peaceful reality and the chaotic, terrifying world Connor had forced upon the boy is stark and undeniable. We do not have a massive indoor swimming pool or a fleet of luxury imported vehicles parked outside. We do not host lavish, extravagant charity galas to impress superficial neighbors who would instantly abandon us at the first sign of trouble. We have something infinitely more valuable and rare. We have absolute, genuine peace. Sitting there on the porch watching Leo push his new toy train across the wooden planks, I found myself reflecting heavily on the true, genuine meaning of wealth and family. For decades, I had watched my son Connor obsessively chase after a hollow, empty vision of success. He believed that power was purely measured by the immense square footage of a white marble mansion and the luxury brand of the sports car parked in the vast driveway. He falsely believed that elite social status and highly exclusive country club memberships could somehow magically elevate him above the basic fundamental rules of human decency. He was utterly, entirely wrong in every possible way. I have learned through the hardest, most agonizing lessons life can possibly teach that pure, unadulterated greed is a silent, insidious disease. It does not just ruin your bank account or destroy your professional career. It rots a person completely from the inside out. It entirely consumes your conscience, your natural empathy, and your moral soul, until there is absolutely nothing left but a ravenous, empty, black hole. Connor willingly sacrificed his own basic humanity for the fleeting, fragile illusion of elite social status. He casually traded the sacred duty of a protective father for the shallow, fake applause of private equity investors who ultimately completely abandoned him the very second his fraudulent financial ship began to sink into the ocean. I look back at the empire he tried to build, and I clearly see exactly what it truly was. It was a massive, delicate house of cards built entirely on stolen money and shattered lives. He thought his expensive corporate lawyers and his carefully manicured reputation would protect him from the inevitable consequences of his monstrous actions. But the universe has a very specific way of balancing the scales of justice. I often think about the profound nature of systemic karma. It is not just a mystical concept or a comforting fairy tale we tell ourselves to feel better about the injustices of the world. It is a very real, tangible force of nature. When you aggressively build a life entirely upon a foundation of deceit, manipulation, and the exploitation of the highly vulnerable, you are actively sowing the seeds of your own inevitable destruction. Connor and Jessica thought they were the smartest, most untouchable people in the room. They believed their sheer arrogance and hoarded wealth would permanently shield them from the consequences of their profound cruelty. But the very legal and financial systems they had so expertly manipulated to steal Leo Trust Fund were the exact same systems that ultimately ground them into fine dust. They were completely stripped of their stolen assets, publicly humiliated in front of their elite peers, and locked away in cold concrete cells. They lost absolutely everything because they had fundamentally built their entire empire on absolutely nothing real. The universe simply corrected the massive imbalance they had created. True, enduring strength is not found in bespoke, tailored suits or towering corporate boardrooms. It is not found in the cowardly ability to hire expensive, aggressive lawyers to intimidate the weak and silence the truth. True, absolute strength is found in the unyielding willingness to firmly stand up for the innocent. It is found in the rare courage to look directly at a terrifying, corrupt legal system and firmly refuse to ever back down. It is found in the terrifying, agonizing decision to destroy your own blood, your own biological son, if that son has actively chosen to become a sociopathic monster. Protecting a defenseless, frightened child, protecting the highly vulnerable from the predatory, relentless greed of the powerful is the absolute only legacy that truly matters in this harsh, unforgiving world. I spent my entire adult life carefully building heavy steel structures that would firmly stand the test of harsh time. But saving young Leo from the absolute, terrifying darkness of that padded attic, and giving him the wonderful chance to grow up surrounded by genuine affection and absolute safety, is the greatest, most important thing I have ever built. The corrupt elite deeply believe they can simply buy their way out of any consequence, but they foolishly forget that a foundation built on lies and human suffering will always inevitably collapse under the crushing heavy weight of absolute righteous justice. The long, painful journey from the dark, cold corners of deception to the bright, warm light of truth has fundamentally changed me forever. I used to firmly believe that family was purely defined by the shared blood running through our physical veins. I thought loyalty was an automatic, permanent right granted by biology alone. Now, I deeply know better. True family is actively chosen every single day through compassionate actions, through unwavering protection, and through the absolute, steadfast refusal to let the darkness consume the light. Susan and I may be well into our golden years, but we have suddenly found an entirely new, profound purpose. We are the fierce, loving guardians of a brilliant young boy who survived the absolute worst of human nature and is now learning how to beautifully, bravely thrive. I look at the peaceful, quiet, beautiful life we have built now, and I know with absolute deep certainty that the brutal, agonizing war was worth every single casualty. The heavy battle was fought and the wicked were completely, entirely routed from their high castles. Evil thrives when good people decide to look the other way to keep the peace. You reap exactly what you sow. If you stand with this grandfather's fight for justice, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of truth coming to light. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from and what time is it there right now? I read every single one, and it brings me joy to know how far this story has reached.